Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. If you're searching for an incredible novel, check out my Patreon page. Your support will help transform this story into an exciting audiobook. Join me on this adventure. By becoming a Patreon member, you'll be helping me keep creating and bringing this content to life. Thank you for being part of the journey.
Chapter 41. Premonitions. Huff, huff. I breathed heavily as the bubble tumbled around within the queen's stomach. The cracks on the bubble made me worried that the structure might collapse and leave me to be slowly digested in the stomach acids of the giant Shinhu. After some time, the tumbling subsided and the bubble softly traveled through the innards of the beast. I sat back down onto the bed, breathing a sigh of relief. My eyes turned unfocused for a bit as a smile stretched itself ear to ear on my beautiful face. I had done it. I had finally become the heroine of this story. Bam, the one that stole everything from me, the one that had no more purpose in life than to follow me. Yet still the one that had taken the place of the hero from me was gone. I had finally become the heroine, destined to see the stars one day. Ha, ha, ha. A low laugh escaped my mouth, eventually transforming into a full-blown laughter. Ha 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 ha. The sole sound of my laughter, music to my ears, rang in the surroundings. I laid onto the bed, my limbs sprawled about and closed my eyes with a gigantic smile gracing my lips. I remembered what the angel had said. The boy is the one that took the risk. And so did the young man. And so, that boy will become the hero of this story, and the man an outlier, a being unbound by it. And what of you? I hummed a sweet tone, shaking my head side to side, unable to contain my excitement. I chuckled in a high-pitched tone, slamming my face into the pillows, squealing as I did so with my legs rapidly kicking the bed mattress. I will make you the heroine of this story. In exchange, you just need to do something for me. The angel had chuckled at the time. My eyes glazed over slightly as images of Bam flooded my mind. The giddiness in my heart could not be stopped. Everything I ever deserved would be mine now. That monster was never worthy or everything I would be capable of getting. He was a mistake, something that shouldn't even be alive. But now, I had done God's work. Then, images of someone else overlapped my vision. It was a dark-haired young man with dark black eyes. He stood at a height of 1.85 meters and had an enchanting and laid-back disposition. The outlier, Winston Heath. I giggled. Soon, I said to no one in particular, my eyes taking a strange emotion. I am going to have everything I ever wanted and will want in the future. After all, I am the heroine of this story. Everyone exists only to serve me. I am destined to see the stars. Everyone waited at the bottom of a large structure, in front of which the queen's anus was exposed from where Bam and Rachel were to be shot out. Winston sat onto a nearby bench along with Zarin and Amon, as did Anak. The rest of the regulars stood some distance away, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the two people. They did not have to wait too long, as in just 5 minutes worth of time, the bubble came out along with all of the queen's undigested food. Splat. The bubble cracked upon impacting solid ground and a sole female supported herself on her arms, her hair and body drenched in a green fluid. Every rushed towards her, eager to greet them. However, as they drew closer, they noticed something. Where's Bam? Amon asked, his tone shaking a bit. Rachel didn't speak, only gritting her teeth in response as if holding deep emotions within. Winston, who was at the back, stared at her. His spirit vision activated. His eyes reflected the figure of Rachel in its entirety, a plethora of colors blazing at her body. Besides her legs, which were blackened in spirit vision, suggesting a lack of operation, the rest of her body was perfectly fine. Her emotional colors were in disarray, expression deep sadness and regret. Seeing this, Winston had a bad premonition. Hey! Yellow turtle! Rak yelled. Where's the black turtle? Winston felt Zarin tightening his grip on the spear, watching on at the scene that was unfolding. He! Rachel spoke in a sort of hushed whisper, however, it was perfectly heard by everyone. Bam! He fell off the platform while fighting off the bull. Rachel choked on her breath, a singular tear streaming down her face. He sacrificed himself to save me, she said. Everyone was quiet for a moment. No! Turtle! Rak yelled out in despair. Everyone else felt a weird emotion arising in their stomachs, feeling extremely unsure about the situation. Winston stole a glance at Kun, whose eyes were covered by his hair. Without a word, Winston began to walk back. Then, he took out a coin from his pocket and flicked it up. Bam is dead. He repeated in his head 7 times. The coin landed onto his palm, and as he opened it, the coin displayed a clear tails. He closed his palm and kept the coin back into his pocket. Everyone passed the test. Apparently, Bam had made a deal with the administrator, which entailed that even if Bam failed the test, everyone else would be allowed to ascend to the next floor and not fail the test. That sole fact made everyone feel a great debt towards the boy. Rachel had passed out after she descended from the queen's stomach, and thereby rested in her room. Everyone else gathered in the hall to think over their next course of actions. It was at that moment that Kun proposed something. He would take Rachel up the tower with him, in order to fulfill one last wish of Bam, due to which he was going to pass the test. Everyone else also agreed through subtle communication tics and deception from Kun, though it was hardly needed. Winston was the only one, aside from Zarin, who had not outright agreed to the proposal, but since he did not object to it, everyone assumed he would also participate, an endeavor that he was not sure he would partake in at the moment. However, as everyone left the hall, Winston was approached by the blue-haired young man. "Winston," he called out. Winston raised an eyebrow. "I have something to talk to you about," he said. Winston nodded, and they headed back to his room for further discussions. After they reached his room, Kun continued with the conversation. "It's about Rachel," he said grimly. "What about her?" Winston was unsure where the conversation was going. Kun's eyes held a slight edge, something Winston was not used to seeing. Through his spirit vision, he noticed a strange emotion of rage and unclarity flowing through his psyche. "I talked with Mr. Rowe about her condition. Although the official reports say that she can't walk and the cure is only on the upper floors." Kun took a slight pause. Through Mr. Rowe's own observation, along with a doctor he had asked for a report, her legs are perfectly fine. Winston's eyes widened in bafflement. "You mean?" he asked, unsurely. Kun nodded. "She lied," he declared. "The wound was even that fatal. It did no damage concerning her legs, neither did it damage any major tissues." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Winston walked along a hallway, walking in front of doors that led to the rooms of several regulars. Eventually, he stopped in front of Rachel's. With a strange expression, he gazed silently at the door, his spirit vision peering through the wall. Rachel, who was laying on the bed and sleeping, had her entire body clad in white, a symbol of excellent health. The black color he had seen was all but gone at this point. Someone, or something. It messed with the information traveling through the spirit world. He thought with a rough face. He gritted his teeth as he looked at her emotions. Happiness, contentment, cold clarity and glee. He shook his head as he remembered what Kun intended to do. Apparently, he planned to tell Shibisu about the fact too. Winston walked back. His emotions were in a mess. Things just got a lot more complicated. His spirit vision scanned his surroundings, trying to see through anything that might still be prying at him. He put his hand into a pocket and took out the coin. "Bam is dead. Bam is dead," he repeated 7 times. Then, he flipped the coin. Ding! The coin danced in the air and fell towards his hand. However, it fell right off to the ground after bouncing off. The divination had failed. Winston picked up the coin, his face devoid of any real expression. Coincidences. So that's why. Winston felt that he had uncovered some strange secret, a game that was happening constantly in the shadows, which he had somehow managed to uncover. Then, he felt his sequence 7 potion, an object that felt closer to him yet infinitely far away. He shook his head, feeling hundreds of possible explanations arise in his mind. From the forces of jihad to the strange rabbit, Hedon, there was nothing he could confirm at the moment. He sighed and decided to head back to his room, practice cogitation and calm his emotions. As for progression to the next sequence, he decided to do so after ascending to the next floor. For some inexplicable reason, the floor of tests seemed like a giant trap, someplace he did not feel comfortable in to try and ascend. As he was walking back, he suddenly smiled. A smile that carried a million emotions. A smile that masked every other emotion under it. A smile befitting of a clown. On an unknown floor of the tower, in a dark cave-like place, something stirred. A strange red light flashed onto the walls and the surroundings, illuminating the various murals embossed onto the wall and the plethora of statues with demon-like faces in a baleful crimson glow. A large hole was in the ceiling, revealing a large moon that shone with a dark light. A humanoid figure got up from the ground, stretching its arms and body with a groan. Then, it scratched its back with its flexible arms. The figure stood at an intimidating 7 feet tall and was increasingly muscular, making it appear intimidating in the red light. Slowly, the figure walked fully into the light. And there he stood, a massive hulking man, his skin a pale silver in color with albino hair and a pair of red eyes. His face was stretched into a wicked grin, revealing white teeth. His face held features that looked somewhat similar to a young man, yet he also held various wrinkles on his face. Tired, he said, it's been long since the directions of fate turned to violently, they're barely being held together. Man. I haven't had to move personally since that guy pissed me off. The man bellowed with a strange, beast-like growl. Then he laughed. I suppose being a silver dwarf isn't all that great after all, huh? But I guess I've been inactive for long enough, he said and walked off. I wish you all luck, regulars. Han Sung-yu smiled as he saw off the regulars. Before you go, I would like you give something to all of you. With his words, a plate floated onto the platform where everyone stood. The plate held various black rings. This is a token of remembrance for all of you. I hope you all achieve great things, he said. Everyone took the rings and donned them on their fingers. And then, they were teleported to the next floor. End of Volume 1, Vistas of the Test Floor. /n. There you have it, folks. I will not be beginning with the second volume until I have completed all the chapters beforehand, just so you know. Otherwise, I might even drop off the novel due to stress of uploading every day. Even so, I don't want to extend the upload schedule since such a schedule is needed for being a contracted author. So yeah, expect a big break. Also, I didn't have any plans initially about this novel, and this was supposed to be just some side project that I would write for fun, but it has become something way more popular than I had expected. And since that's the case, it is my duty as an author to not drop the novel and provide an ending for anyone that may choose to stick with it. Still though, no promises. Throw some stones and see you next volume. Cheers. Chapter 42. Cicada, 1. Rain littered the sea as the dark clouds ran through the sky, twisting and twirling in tandem with the waves as if they were alive. Gigantic mountains towered over in the eastern horizons and tumultuous waves crashed over the entire ocean. A lonesome boat, not too large yet not too small in size, traveled amongst a sea of wooden remains, a graveyard of previous ships that had been crushed by the wrath of water and storm. Men glanced over the deck at the barren wasteland that had been made of the previously cheerful fleet. Then one of them pointed out in one direction, where lay a lonesome floating piece of wood atop which was mounted a ginormous living creature. A net was cast, and the living creature was caught. It had a yellow, pale, and deathly demeanor with a nose elongated and teeth protruding out from the sides. Its eyes were a bewitching boundless white and remained almost hollowed in the living creature's sockets, and its body was bulbous and rotund with 2 arms and 2 legs with claws marring each limb. Warts grew on the living creature in waves, and from its nose dripped a strange red snot that dripped down its obese body. The men took it back to the mountains in the horizons, hauling it up to the top upon large wooden rails. They set up the creature onto the front of the shrine of their gods, and the creature got up. The men knelt in fear while others brandished their weapons in alarm as the creature overtook its large blue claws and slashed at its own skin. And from its skin poured out treasures. Pearls of quality never seen by them before, blood in a color of gold and silver nuggets pouring out like water from a dam. The men stood in silence, entranced by the riches. The living creature snorted onto the women, turning them beautiful. The malnourished children were fed a small blue bead that the creature pulled out from its skin, revitalizing the poor creatures. The creature was revered, shrines were made and fishes were fed to it. The living creature brought prosperity, and the small village soon turned into a metropolis upon which souls in search of food, shelter and opportunities all the same stumbled into to test their fortune and wits. The lost souls guided themselves to the living creature to receive its blessing, each receiving all the successes they could hope just from a small glance by its hallowed eyes that peered out from its darkened face, or from a single touch from its clawed hands that could crush a man's skull whole and pierce through rock without trouble. The creature grew larger with the fish and delicacies, and the pilgrims continued on. The temples the living creature stayed in cheered with life and vigor as lost souls guided themselves in. Each time the creature slashed its skin, gold, pearls, silver and diamonds would rush out, pooling at the pilgrim's feet. Then, a lone man stood, his visage fierce and his figure malnourished with his eyes clouded in greed and in fear. He rushed through the crowd with a knife in hand and slashed at the creature's skin. The riches began to pool at his feet as the creature in a baleful scream backhanded the man, twisting his nose and blinding him in one eye in the process. The guards rushed upon the man as the riches pooled at the floor. The priests fervently chanted scriptures in seek of forgiveness for the greater atrocity commented. The other pilgrims overcame by greed brandished their weapons, their faces contorted in madness and a deranged frenzy. They laughed and laughed as they all rushed upon the living creature, tearing its body in horror of the priests. Yet the priests were human too, consumed by their own greed. The limbs of the creature were cut off, its golden blood was drained. Its teeth were made of diamonds and bones were made of jade. Pearls the size of a man's chest poured out from its chest and head, and the golden blood flowed through the ground and out into the streets. A strange laughter filled the air still as the creature was dismantled, eventually leaving nothing behind. The priests had their way with women who too were too clouded in their own euphoria. The men peed onto the corpse of the living creature, a being that they once worshipped. The eyes of the creature bred trouble and bloodbath. Dozens fought, and one came out victorious that would take the eyes home. Everything was plundered. Everything was ruined. And so, a large storm enveloped the metropolis, decimation in all corners and regression of the area into a perfect domain of nature. The mountain razed to the ground. Only a plain ground not far from the sea remained. The creature, nay, a husk of it stood tall amid the rubble, its body now blackened and carrying red and thin and frail, with bones protruding out as if it had no skin to speak of. Its face was disfigured, and its body was unrecognizable. And from the clouds above that reigned still, a black-haired man came out, his long black hair flowing freely behind his back and his body adorned by long flowing white robes. The man landed before the living creature and smiled. "You see now, don't you?" The living creature bellowed. "See what? People are flawed. Eventually, they all destroy themselves. That is the truth of this world. You and me. We need not concern ourselves with them, for they are below us. Feeble and tiny. Too consumed by their own faults to do anything else. What you created here was an example, not the proof," the man declared, a simple smile on his face. "If you wish to test the toughness of glass, it is bound to shatter. Reversing the consequence and cause, all that just for the sake of winning. Causing chaos just to prove a point. How absurd." The creature stilled, its red eyes gazing at the man. "And what of you?" the creature said. "What of me? You came here not too long ago. You do not know how everything works. You see the worst in people. You have seen the worst in people, particularly that insufferable man. Perhaps that's what bothers you. Maybe." The man chuckled. If the news of this were to get out, chaos would ensue through the tower. The living creature turned its head to look at the sea. "Why?" it asked. The man turned simply and smiled out to the sea. Then, he muttered, "It's not every day one can see you in such a state, you know? Even high rankers might freak out." The living creature remained silent, only glancing briefly at its blackened and red body that looked emaciated. "Ah-ha-ha! Ha-ha-ha!" A childlike giggle rang across the streets. Rain poured down from the sky, tears of the clouds bouncing on the brick roads like musical notes falling on a great instrument. Birds perched themselves on trees and under extended roofs, shielding themselves from the pour. Chuckles and giggles rang amid the sound of the rain as a small group of children ran along the streets, closely followed by a pack of dogs that circled around them in giddiness and playfulness. The children, drenched whole, smiled and laughed along as they passed many wooden houses and trees. Pitter-patter, pitter-patter. Then, as the pitter-patter of rain continued to reverberate, the children suddenly stopped, the pack of dogs stopping alongside them. The kids glanced over to their front, where their path stayed blocked by a large figure. It was a large man, standing about 7 feet tall in height. He had bright white hair with a pale silver skin, as if all blood had been sucked clean from his body. His eyes were bright red, mimicking the color of blood which he seemed oh so deficient of. The man, who was smiling ear to ear, had a strangely childlike face, yet also wrinkles that ran along it, making him appear quite odd. If anyone were to describe his features with as little words as possible, perhaps the phrase incomplete might come to mind. That's right. The face of the man seemed incomplete, though the kids were none the wiser. The man wore a dark trench coat which glistened in the rain. He wore silver cargo pants on his legs and wore dark leather boots. In his hands was a black suitcase of sorts. As the man noticed the children stopping at his appearance, his smile seemingly widened, if that were even possible. "Hello, kids. May I ask you for some directions?" His voice was deep, yet somehow not, again, appearing increasingly strange. As he spoke, the kids clamored around and began to run the opposite way. The smile on the man's face dropped for a second before he shook his head. Then he walked along the quiet brick road. His disposition was serene and calm, in complete contrast with his hulking stature. Walking for a while and passing through the streets of the small village, he came in front of a large house, in front of which were 2 benches. Without a word, the man sat onto the bench. The raindrops and water atop the bench miraculously evaporated and moved away from his seat, as did the drops that were falling atop him. In just a moment, his surroundings turned inert of rain as if it was avoiding him like a plague. He sat around the bench for a time. The clouds above swaddled off towards the horizons, revealing a bright sun behind them. The petrichor that emanated from the rapidly drying grass seemed intoxicating. Then, the man turned his head upon hearing footsteps to the left. There, a man of a shorter stature walked along, a large bag full of wood on his back. The man stood at a height of 5 foot 11 inches or 1.80 meters and had light brown hair with a lazy, almost sleep-deprived disposition. There was a hint of dark circles under his eyes and he yawned while he walked. The man wore a simple t-shirt with dark-colored pajamas and a pair of Crocs at his feet. As the man drew in closer, his eyes widened a bit seeing the hulking albino sitting at the bench. He approached and asked, "Who are you?" The albino smiled, "I'm looking for someone." "Heh." The man chuckled and walked behind him, heading towards the door to his house. "Then you're in the wrong place, my friend." He shook his head and unlocked the door. "Why do you say so?" The albino whispered, yet his words reached the man all the same. "People don't come here to find anyone. There's no one worth finding here." He turned back and looked at the albino's back. He had not moved from his seat at the bench. As the man went to close the door, the albino spoke again, this time with volume. "I'm here for a Theo-Lise." He laughed. The man stopped in his tracks and widened the gap of the door. "Theo-Lise clear. Ring any bells?" The man turned his head slightly and looked on. "Who's asking?" The albino stood up and walked up to the door. "Myself, Samuel Hellmans," he said. "Can I come in?" The man looked on for a moment in suspicion, yet strangely enough, he let the albino in without too much trouble. The albino ducked under the door and walked inside, inhaling the slightly musty odor of wood and a thick scent of coffee. "You seem to really like coffee." Samuel chuckled. The man shook his head. "It helps me sleep," he said. The albino raised an eyebrow and asked with a quizzical expression, "Coffee helps you sleep? That's odd." The man laughed a bit. "No. I farm coffee beans. Brings in good money. May I have some?" "Depends on what you say next. Why are you here and why are you looking for me?" The albino, with a compassionate gaze, sat down onto a chair. Due to his tall stature, him sitting on the small chair looked rather comical. "I'm looking for people. To help me. Let's say to sort something out." Theo-Lise sat down opposite him onto a rocking chair with a glass of water in hand. Then, taking a sip, he spoke. "And what will they get in return after helping you?" "Haha. It's the other way around." His eyes curved into a crescent moon shape. "In truth, the one that's getting the benefits first is you." "How so?" "I'll get you into the inner tower." His deep yet soft voice bellowed. Theo-Lise raised an eyebrow in suspicion. "Inner tower? You mean you'll take the people that agree to climb the tower?" "Bingo. You get 10 points." Samuel laughed. "But that's impossible. Only the regulars chosen by the Guardian can get into the tower," he said. "Heh. That might be the general case, but it's not the only possibility." He extended his finger and shook it side to side. Then a mystical illusion began to materialize in the air. It depicted a large cylinder. Think of this as the inner tower. What the Guardian does is transport everyone to the second floor, the floor of tests. The bottom of the cylinder glowed. Then, from the bottom, a number of lines began to extend into nothingness. Then, even the entire cylinder began to grow with lines that extended out from its center and disappearing into the air. However, there are many paths still that one can take to get there. As long as one passes a certain threshold, they will be judged by the Guardian, and if deemed worthy, they will also be chosen. As long as the Guardian offers a tactic approval, there's no need to be waiting to get chosen. Samuel smiled. It's a very crude way of going about it, and most of the time, it's not very appreciated by the tower populace and hence, the information is blocked about it. But the Guardian seems to have no real problems with this. "And how did you come to know about it?" "I am a silver dwarf. I can see crossroads that others cannot. Finding a path is my speciality." Theo-Lise sat in contemplation for a bit. "And what if the one that intends to cross the inner tower isn't chosen?" he asked. "He dies in despair, knowing that there is no way from him to reach for the greater beyond. He is locked from the tower forever," he said. The illusion disappeared. "And what of the thing you want in return? That has to wade into the trade, right? But think of it. What greater favor can I do you than to put you in a place where you can ascend beyond your wildest imaginations? What greater good can I do for you than to get you into the tower?" he asked. "But still?" Theo-Lise hesitated. "There's no need to be so hesitant. All I will ask you is aid in restoring fate." "Fate?" "Yes. Someone has been quite riled up recently. Fate is in shambles. It's barely following its original course, as if it will break apart into chaos at a moment's notice. But isn't watching fate something the red witches do? Samuel scratched his chin. You're pretty knowledgeable. Now that I think about it, that would be a power of the red witches rather than the silver dwarfs. I do apologize. I'm not too used to having such abilities. He chuckled. Theolise looked at him strangely, in puzzlement. Looking at such a large man apologizing to him was quite a weird experience for him. However, there was one thing that caught his attention. Not used to? That's quite a weird thing to say, he said. Samuel shook his head. Is that really what we're here to discuss? Are you going to participate or not? Theolise clicked his tongue. Then he said, one last thing. Why me? Pardon? Why me? I'm not something special. As a matter of fact, I'm as average as they come. There's nothing average about you. The man smiled knowingly. What's that supposed to mean? I can see paths. And the path has led me here, to you. And since the path has guided me, there must be something that's special about you, he said with confidence. Not to mention that I'm not choosing just one or two people. As a matter of fact, I've talked to hundreds of people. I can talk to a random beggar on the streets and offer him a way into the tower. Even if there's nothing special about them, that won't be the case forever, right? Only special people survive in the tower. Everyone that's mediocre gets culled out. As his words landed, there was silence for a moment. If Theolise were to use his common sense, the man was nothing but shady. His motives were questionable at best, and there was no saying if he was a part of some organ trafficking organization. Any normal man in this situation would surely refuse, as would any intelligent one. You wanted coffee? Some biscuits if you have any. I don't. They attract rodents. That's unfortunate. With that, Theolise got him some coffee, unsure whether the decision he had made was the right call or not. A/N. Hello people. Volume 2, Hunter in the Waves, officially stars from here. Strap in. I'm not sure if there will be a chapter every day, though that will be the goal. But that can change to a chapter every 2 days. We'll have to see. And there will be some breaks where I don't upload for the day. Also, the first part of this chapter was similar to a chapter in Journey to the West, also depicted in the third act, ending in Black Myth Wukong. Check out the ending. It's real nice animation. Also, perhaps read Journey to the West? It's leagues better than anything one might find in the average web novel fanfiction. LOL. P.S. Check out the synopsis for the rough premise of the second volume. Cheers. Throw some stones. Get the FIC to the top of the rankings. We must assemble the previous audience. Chapter 43. Ocean Blue. The sound of ocean waves crashing rang in his ears constantly, as did the chirping of seagulls in the distance. Winston looked on towards the horizons where he saw 3 floating islands silently hovering in the air. The gentle waves washed over the small wooden boat he stood on, rocking it back and forth with the flow of the water. A thick stench of salt lingered in the air. Winston wore a black suit, consisting of black pantaloons and a low-hanging tailcoat, under which was a white linen shirt. Atop his black-haired head was a half-top hat. His eyes were clouded with strange colors as he peered out into the horizon, a signature for his spirit vision. On his face was a smile. What was the plan again? Someone asked from behind him. Winston turned his head slightly, gazing to the speaker from the corner of his eyes. It was a man with dirty brown hair, sitting down onto the edge of the small boat. His eyes were sleek and held a slight edge, and in his hands rested a large red spear, the handle of which was embossed with various strange and alien symbols. The man wore a simple t-shirt with predominantly red coloring to go along with streaks of white running vertically. Below, he wore dark-colored pants. It was none other than Zarin Zelasicale. Attack. Winston chuckled and put a hand into his pocket. Then he took out a bright blue coin and twirled it around his fingers. Zarin raised an eyebrow. I remember it being a bit more complicated, he said. No need to use too much of your brain. We just need to secure the island. Winston shook his head. Can't you get us there any faster? He asked. Bored already? Winston chuckled. Zarin clicked his tongue, not answering. Winston shook his head. Amon, Anak and Lore are approaching from the other ends. If we mess up the timing, it won't be ideal. Zarin clicked in tongue again, turning his head away. You're no fun. We can take care of it either way. A chuckle sounded in response to his comment. Patience, my friend, he said. It is a virtue of greatness. Besides, proper preparation had been done to devise this strategy. Going off course would not be right. As of right now, they were taking the test of the 12th floor. It had been 5 months since their ascent to the 3rd floor, and they rapidly climbed through the floors. The idea was simple. they would speed through the floors until the 21st, where they would become E-ranked regulars and would not have any issue for points and would not be on a deadline for tests, a plan that Winston had no issues with. Their group was mostly united still, except for two major differences. The first was the fact that Kun and Rachel had chosen to split up from them at the 5th floor, something Winston was honestly thankful for. Staying with the yellow-haired girl was infuriating for him, as was putting up with her act. There was also the fact that the mysterious patron she had behind her made Winston always at edge. It even made his promotion to Sequence 7, which was the barrier of the mid-sequences, somewhat dangerous since his emotions were riled up due to stress of being under constant observation and led through coincidences. After the last test on the 2nd floor, Winston had always been on the edge for any strange coincidences that could be happening around him. Thankfully, he did not notice anything unusual since then. But that didn't make it any better for the situation. As much as he wished to get rid of the root problem, which was the freckled girl, his intuition made him well aware of the dangers that could cause. And so, he persisted. The second change among their group was the separation of Rack and Pericule from their group on the 7th floor, for reasons that Winston could not begin to comprehend. Rack's thinking was too complicated for him to understand clearly. Another thing worth mentioning was his promotion to the next sequence, along with the necessary digestion he could do. The Sequence 7 in the pathway to the divine marked the area of the mid-sequences, a barrier which when crossed offers conceptualization of some of the Beyonder abilities. Of course, the conceptualization was not so powerful at this point. At best, a mid-sequence could be considered as a small army on their own, with the real strength in the divine path coming along when the Beyonder reaches the barrier of a demigod, and even further than that, an angel. Thought that was still too far in the future. The best thing about these couple of months was the fact that his acting had bore significant results, propelling his digestion to about 87%. Sequence 7 of the Fool pathway was the Magician, a sequence that significantly enhanced dexterity, flexibility, balance, and his spirit vision. Along with that, it was the sequence which brought along the most abilities out of the three. In essence, it offered 9 unique abilities, or spells that could be performed without any concentration of spirituality. The spells included damage transfer, a spell that allowed him to transfer damage from any part of his body to the other, turning fatal wounds like heart punctures into a hole in one's hand. It was worth noting that any wound could be transferred only once, and the damage couldn't be transferred to inanimate objects or other people. The next was Flaming Jump, which allowed a magician to jump through the spirit world by entering into flames to appear in a distance of 30 meters, though the range had been extended to 100 meters due to his overwhelmingly stronger spirituality and potion digestion. And to go along with Flaming Jump, magicians possessed flame control, which let them ignite things nearby, and some immunity to flames up to a certain extent. The next was Air Bullets, which was a bullet of compressed air that a magician can fire at will using a trigger sound, like a finger snap or mimicking the sound of a gun from one's mouth. The next one was Paper Figurine Substitution, the most important ability of a magician, as Winston would argue. It allowed for a magician to substitute themselves for a paper figurine, avoiding any sort of damage and even avoid curses. After a paper figurine substitution, the magician would soon appear somewhere nearby. In essence, it was the basis of a Fool pathway Beyonder's cockroach-like resilience in the mid-sequences. After that, there were powers like illusion creation, which allowed him to create wide-scale illusions due to increased spirituality, drawing paper weapons, and bone softening. All of them made way for the magician sequence to be one of the best milestones in the Fool pathway. As for the next pathway, which was the Error, its Sequence 7 was aptly named Cryptologist. By far, the best thing this sequence had given him was the knowledge of mysticism and the ability to decrypt knowledge through small bits of it. It allowed him to finally experiment with ritualistic magics and gave him the ability to make usable charms, although they weren't too great. The sequence was named as so because to the ability of decryption, which essentially allowed them to recreate and reverse engineer any knowledge and process through which mysticism could somehow be related, going so far as to even allowing a cryptologist to decrypt the honorific names of deities. It significantly increased physical ability along with finally providing minor conceptualization to both deception and theft. Now he could steal any object from someone as long as physical contact was maintained, along with being able to mask his intentions and lead his opponent through deception. It was something Winston was exceedingly happy about. And finally, the Sequence 7 of the Door pathway, which was named Astrologer. It was the sequence Winston was the most disappointed about. The entire powers of an astrologer, which was related to divination through stargazing, was essentially useless in the tower because the stars were artificial. Though it provided him improved spirituality, intuition, and anti-divination properties, it couldn't compare to the other two sequences. Regardless, Winston was happy for his progress. The acting for a magician was essentially easier than the other two, It only included him preparing extensively for a test and being over the top with a performance. And with the ranker watching over a test, it offered great feedback. The next thing was the cryptologist, which was covered with his research of Shinsu and ritualistic magic, boosting his capabilities to the next level through digestion. Through the combined effect of these two pathways, his digestion had been boosted even though he hadn't actively focused upon these things in the past months. The waves swept underneath, and the clouds ahead were replaced by others. At that point, they reached closer to the floating islands. Winston prepared himself to board the islands as he saw the other boat, atop which Amon, Anak and Lore were mounted, arrive as well. Finally! Some action! Zarin exclaimed, and Winston nodded in response. The test they were given was named Holding the Line and was a team test, like most others. It had an extremely simple premise, which was to occupy an area and defend it for 40 minutes after the start of the test. The thing that made it complicated was the small tweaks made in between. The entire map was a large ocean, amongst which small and large floating islands were kept silently in the air. Each floating island gave a variable amount of points after being occupied for a time of 10 minutes, which was divided as 2 points for the small ones, 5 points for the intermediate ones and 10 points for the especially big ones. As such, the strategy that came to mind in such occupying tests, which was to seize an area at the last moment, could not be applied here. To further the difficulty, each island, depending on its size, was defended by a variable amount of robots called as sentinels. The sentinels would attack the invading team, meaning if an island was unoccupied, the invaders would only need to fight off the robots. However, if it was occupied, they would need to fight off both the robots as well as the regulars holding the line, making it even more important to take hold of an island beforehand. Along with that, each team was given only 4 small wooden boats to traverse the entire ocean, with all of them being spawned at the same spot at the starting of the test. The teams had no idea about their location and could only do speculation about it, and the amount of islands each category held was not specified. Neither was it specified which type of island was at which position in the sea, with each island being marked only as an X on the map. However, with the help of Winston's wayfinding abilities, they had managed to locate the general direction of 2 large islands, prompting them to split up into teams of 2. Winston gazed at the top of the group of islands, finding 2 ocean blue flags waving at the top. His eyes narrowed dangerously as his smile seemingly widened. "There seems to be people up there," he said. Zarin's ears perked up as his words landed. He broke into a cheerful laughter. "What were we waiting for then? Let's go," he said. Then, Shinsu rushed through his legs, making them stronger and more robust. His legs expanded, and with one tremendous effort, he blasted off into the air. Whoosh! The boat heaved in the water as Zarin pushed it back. The middle of the boat took a noticeable dent at this moment. Winston remained perfectly still, not at all minding the rocking boat. His eyes traveled to the other side, where the others were planning to go up. He saw Lore propel the others up using bongs and float up as well. Seeing that, he pressed slightly upon his half-top hat and snapped his fingers. Snap! Crimson flames erupted around him, covering him whole, and he disappeared within them. /N. And so, Winston makes his appearance. Also, I'm working on a Patreon to offer 10 advanced chapters, though it hasn't yet been completely set up. I'll also try to upload advanced chapters for my JJK fanfic onto there, so after I set it up within a day or two's time, you people can check it out if you wish. Also, throw some stones. We must get the FIC on top of the ranks. Cheers. Chapter 44. Strange Man. A blazing orange flame erupted within the bushes in the middle of the trees. The large coconut trees swayed slightly in the wind, as did the thick overgrowth down below. The fire cast a reddish-orange hue on the vegetation, yet did nothing to burn them. Not a second later, the fire began to subside and Winston walked out, his figure completely devoid of any burn marks. As he emerged from the fire, he looked around himself. The surroundings were a collection of coconut trees swaying slightly in the wind with dense vegetation at their base. The sand beneath his shoes was slightly brown in color and was not very hot. Slightly off in the distance, his enhanced vision caught sight of a large structure, dark-colored and built like a castle with 2 main bodies, each of which held a large ocean blue flag at the top. The teams were given randomized colors when the test began. Their team's color was purple. He felt someone land behind him and turned around with a smile. Zarin clicked his tongue as he saw Winston already standing in front of him. "I still don't get how you pull off that stunt with the fire. There's nothing to understand here. I'm just built like that." With that, they both began to walk forward. While doing so, Winston summoned his pocket and began to commune with the other group. "What's your position?" Winston chimed. From the pocket, Amon's voice sounded. "We're to your left. I have 3 observers moving forward, There doesn't seem to be any sentinels probing around within 200 meters, he said. Winston nodded in response. I'll move in first, Winston said without hesitation. He took a step forward and opened the buttons to his coat, letting it hang freely. Inside, there was a bright golden flash, a golden bell keeping still in the underside of the tailcoat. Despite Winston's movements, the bell stayed completely still without sound, as were his footsteps, a testament to a magician's control over their body. Taking a short breath, Winston and Zarin both dashed into the greenery, whizzing past the plant life and over towards the structure ahead with a gust of wind following behind. Winston's disposition was relaxed as he ran ahead. Just then, a soft chime of his bells, which had stayed quiet despite his movement, rang in his ears. Then, he stopped abruptly in his tracks as he looked on towards figures moving around in the distance. They were roughly humanoid in shape, predominantly dark blue in color with lighter shades on their bodies. In their hands, they held various firearm-like weaponry and patrolled around rigidly. Their faces held no eyes or any visible features, appearing completely robotic. 12 sentinels in the distance. 5 to the right, 3 to the left, and the rest straight ahead, Winston said to Zarin, speaking along to the pocket that floated beside him. Copy that, came Amon's quick reply. Behind him, Zarin twirled his spear with frightening proficiency, laughing along as he did so. Zihahaha. My hands have been itching for a fight. The test on the previous floor was boring, he exclaimed. For someone that liked battle and didn't like using his brain, Zarin preferred fighting for a test rather than an intellectual one. He was plenty capable of passing a test that required some degree of intelligence, but he was not as naturally adept at them. Without another word, both of them dashed out, the wind breaking behind them. Winston's tailcoat fluttered in the wind as they approached the sentinels. His bells chimed with more aggressiveness but quieted down with a mental command. Then, a beam dashed out from the side. Shah! Winston ducked under it, dodging a bright blue ray of light that was headed for his head and supported his half-top hat with his hand. Then, he threw a glance at Zarin, who nodded. Whoosh! They both ran in opposite direction, going towards the 2 separate groups of sentinels. As they held ranged weaponry stronger than any conventional spear, getting up close might seem to be the most logical choice. However, boom! Winston jumped out of a large explosion that followed along with a momentary clash with the group of 5 sentinels. His eyes pierced through the dust clouds to see the changed figure of the mechanical marvels. Their guns, which seemed to be a part of their body, had now merged with their hands, transforming into large gauntlets. Not to mention the rest of their body had underwent a rapid mutation, turning bulkier. Right. Winston dashed at them without another word. A rough sound of breaking the sound barrier sounded as his speed exceeded the limits of what any regular below the 30th floor could achieve. Boom! Bang! Almost instantaneously, 2 of the 5 sentinels crumbled down into scraps as Winston appeared behind them. His arms stretched out still in a punching motion and small pieces of metal falling off of them. The rest of the sentinels turned around and created a strange beeping noise that rang out in the air. Winston smiled and rushed at them again. This time, the sentinels dodged to the side, saving them from getting destroyed in a single strike. Instead, only one of them did. One of them redirected its speed, rushing at the spot Winston had stopped at. He tilted his head as the sentinel punched past it, and then, pulling back his fist, he embedded it right into the stomach of the robot. ZZZZZ**. Electrical sparks flew out of his fist as the robot flew back and crumbled into a mess. The spells of the Trickmaster had also been significantly enhanced, though not to the level that they would be usable in a battle of firepower. However, such a limitation could easily be remedied through Shinsu. Looking towards the last sentinel, Winston snapped his finger, and with that the Shinsu around him rippled. Snap! Boom! A gigantic hole blew right through the robot's head, making it collapse. Naturally, the air bullet could also be augmented through Shinsu. This was the experimentation Winston had been holed up in for the past months. The assimilation of Beyonder powers with Shinsu, and the results so far had been particularly great. After taking care of the robots, Winston pinched his top hat and readjusted it to sit better. Then, with a smile, he looked over towards the way Zarin had gone, finding him also having taken care of his share of robots. Winston nodded and both of them dashed towards the large structure. As they ran, Winston dialed in the current situation to the other team, who, at this point, were also heading towards the castle-like structure. As they approached, the bells beneath his coat chimed, and a vision overlapped his senses. It was the vision of a large castle-like structure, and in front of it stood a large door with many sentinels guarding it. And further down into the castle stood a team of 7, their faces blurred out still. Winston smirked. The opposing team had stationed all of their sentinels on the main gate to take care of them, somehow knowing that they were heading for the main gate. A strange glint carried onto his eyes as they curved in a strange anticipation and mischief. Inside the castle, a group of 7 people stood around in vigilance as they looked over towards the gate. 4 of the 7 were male, 2 were female, and 1 had a strange body type, appearing more like an amorphous blob of jelly than a human. One of them men turned towards another, a hulking figure that stood a staggering 7 feet tall, although not too rare in the tower, with a white head and striking red eyes. The hulking man wore a simple trench coat and carried a strange suitcase beside him. His face held a small smile. "Are you sure they would all come through the main gate?" the man asked the giant. The giant's smile widened just a tiny bit, a change imperceptible to the regulars. "Of course. After all, your observers too confirmed the fact, right? What good would it do for me to lie?" He chuckled. The man clicked his tongue in response. "I haven't had the best experience with following silver dwarfs. I'm rather doubtful." He shook his head. One of the women spoke out. "Oh please. What does it matter where they come from anyway? The sentinels will be able to arrive in a small time frame anyway." "I wouldn't be so sure of that." The other woman shook her head, a floating cube behind her. "As per the information I've gathered, the team we're facing at the moment is the team of super rookies that passed from the floor of tests some months ago. They have 2 princesses of jihad and a man with incredible powers on their team. I think Winston Heath was his name?" A man that was seated at the far corner of the large hall scoffed. "So what? There's only 1 princess on the island, right? As for the Winston guy, I'll take care of him," he exclaimed, twirling around a needle in his hand. The hulking man, Samuel Hellmans, furrowed his brows a bit in contemplation, seemingly wanting to say something. But eventually, no words came out of his mouth. Suddenly, a series of explosive sounds rang out on the outside. The light-bearer woman immediately straightened her back, and the lighthouse behind her expanded in size to turn into a large screen. Before long, it displayed a large view of the outside through a lens, appearing like a movie. The screen depicted Winston and Zarin fighting off the sentinels, though they weren't able to damage any of them and were only able to dodge the relentless attacks of the robots. The robots were too many for them to retaliate with an attack. The melee robots were troublesome to begin with, but when coupled with the ranged ones, they seemed to be more than a match for the 2 regulars. "Heh, they don't seem too troublesome. I feel like the sentinels will be done in a little more than 3 minutes. The man with the needle shook his head in disdain. Just then, a reply came from behind him. "Right? That guy is so uncool. He doesn't seem like the rumors at all," chimed the voice. The man nodded in response. Just then he froze, realizing the foreign voice and the fact that all of his team stood in front of him. Slowly, he turned his head. And then, bam! A fist planted right into his face, throwing him back into the ground and knocking him out cold. Zarin stood there with his fist stretched out, a scowl on his face. Behind him stood Winston, who was quietly pinching his top hat, and 3 other people, of which included a green-skinned woman, a dark-haired man wearing a tight robe, and another dark-haired man wearing a white t-shirt and wrapped around him a blanket that floated silently. "Boo," said Winston with a smile. And then chaos descended. The regulars clamored about, rushing away from them to take up some distance. The light-bearer glanced at the lighthouse, only to still find the sentinels engaged in a battle with Winston and Zarin. However, before she could process what was happening, the 2 figures that fought on the screen disappeared into a mystical illusion. The woman's eyes shrank into needles as she felt her hair stand on end. She turned her head rapidly, only to see bongs of shinsu littered in the air, the combined effort of the opposite team. And then, boom! In a single strike, all of their team was eliminated. And with that, Lore, with a wave of his hand, went ahead and hoisted up their flags instead of the other teams, claiming the outpost for themselves. "That was quick," Amon commented, sitting down onto a small flight of stairs with a leisure smile on his face. Anak sat beside him, propping up a green hook on her shoulder. "It was disappointing," she said. Winston stretched his hands into the air and groaned. "I agree. That was indeed a bit disappointing," he droned. However, whoosh! Trang! The bell under his tailcoat chimed, and with it, a vision overlapped his senses. He saw himself getting besieged with 6 bongs, all from roughly the same direction. The bongs impacted his body, although not dealing too much damage to his body, shredding his new clothes into pieces. Immediately, his focus shifted and 5 bongs appeared in the air to his right. And then they fired off. Sha! Boom! The bongs met in the air, triggering a large explosion. However, one of them was too fast for him to avoid, which led to the bongs crashing right into him. However, just as the bong impacted through his body, the entire figure crumbled right into paper, fluttering along in the wind. Winston's teammates were alarmed, their eyes shrinking in surprise and bewilderment at not having sensed anyone close by. "What the hell?" Anak yelled, getting back to her feet. Some distance away, a mystical figure appeared on the ground. Winston had reappeared with the paper figurine substitution, successfully saving his new clothes from being damaged. "Safe," he yelled in his mind. Then, his eyes turned to the perpetrator of the act. There he stood, a strange man with a height of 7 feet and hair white as snow and eyes that shone with a baleful red glint, donning a dark trenchcoat and holding a suitcase at hand. There was a smile stretched across his face as he held his hand onto his chest and bowed a little. "Greetings. Myself Samuel Hellmans." He broke out with a toothy grin. Winston narrowed his eyes at him, and immediately, his spirituality straightened out and converged. And so, bongs of Shinsu materialized in the air behind him. Without any delay, 5 bongs, with the 6th still forming, floated in the air behind him. The strange man only smiled further. Anak, Aman and Zarin came forward, their weapons drawn and ready to engage at a moment's notice. Behind them, Lore floated in the air with 3 bongs in the air around him. "This is quite a predicament, it seems." Samuel chortled. And the suitcase he held at his side trembled. Winston's hair stood on edge as he fired off the bongs he had made, simultaneously casting various spells. Anak, Aman and Zarin all collectively rushed at the man, aiming to finish him before he finished what he had started. Boom! Crash! Sha! The large dust cloud appeared in place, covering all of their vision, save for Winston's. Casting a wind spell, the dust cleared out, and what appeared was only empty space with no trace of the man. Chapter 45. 13th Floor. Winston looked around in every direction, slowly turning. Then, looking in a particular direction, the bells beneath the coat chimed. That was all the directions he needed. With a slight effort of his legs, he dashed out of the castle at full speeds. His teammates yelled something behind him, yet he paid them no mind. Dashing right out of the castle and right out of the vegetation that followed after, he reached the end of the island. Endless blue was what he saw at the horizons, and the water glistened through the air, reflecting the scintillating sun up above. And there, approximately 1 kilometer away in the water, was a small canoe, atop which was seated a white-haired behemoth. Winston narrowed his eyes at him. With his improved eyesight, he could clearly see through the large distance. The man who was silently rowing the boat suddenly looked over at him and waved with a compassionate smile. The corner of Winston's lips almost twitched. Almost. Then, shaking his head, he headed back to the castle. The way the man disappeared was enigmatic for sure, even to the point of almost escaping his own senses and his crytologist observation power. However, in the end, Winston had always remained aware of the strange abilities Shinsu could help manifest. There were certain things he was sure of, such as the image not being an illusion and no amount of teleportation being involved. That itself narrowed the scope of what could have happened down, and he could simply reverse engineer from there. Besides, there was no merit in chasing a strange man through the sea just because there was a failed attempt at ruining his new suit. Winston sighed and decided not to worry about the strange encounter. There were bound to be plenty down the line anyways. The rest of the test went without any hiccups. Shibasu's team was able to secure another large island which made them sit comfortably in the top 3 teams. And before long, they had already passed the test and earned the right to get to the 13th floor. Winston walked out of the transport zone of the floors. The transition between all the floors required the permission of the specific administrator that reigned over that floor, ensuring that they had indeed earned the right to ascend. Naturally, it only included the regulars that were ascending for the first time. For the regulars that had already been to a specific floor, not much permission was needed and they could freely come and go, although they were limited in what they could do on a lower floor. Winston's eyes met the beautiful scenery of numerous stone sculptures that floated atop large islands in the sea. What he stood atop of was a large marvel of mechanical engineering, a gigantic ship that floated in the air by itself. Through Winston's spirit vision, the mechanics behind the floating ship were revealed quite effortlessly. With the crytologist, astrologer and magician potions, his spirit vision had transcended beyond any sequence 7. He even suspected it had reached the potential of a sequence 5 of the hermit pathway. "What do you say? Should we take a little time off?" Shibasu's voice came from behind him. He turned his head slightly, looking at him from the corner of his eye. Then, he smiled. "Is that your own question, or someone else's?" Winston chuckled. Shibasu scratched his head and walked forth, leaning onto the railing that Winston was leaning at. It was the 2 princesses that wanted the break. Though I can see everyone wants a short one as well. The previous months have been quite hectic for them. said Shibisu, who still wore a tracksuit, albeit of a different color scheme. He laughed dryly. The princesses weren't too comfortable with asking you. He shook his head. Winston also mimicked his laugh, feeling a bit awkward. Within this short time, Winston had been tacitly elected as the co-leader of the group, right along with Shibisu. And so, the decisions of their group were left to the two of them, with the rest of the members conveying their respective wishes to them. And for some reason, the two princesses had taken it upon themselves to appear more worthy of the princess title in front of him. For that reason, they followed through with all of his commands and tests, and even trained and sparred alongside him. As of the current moment, only Winston was capable of somewhat controlling the two tanks on their team. He did not know the exact reason, but it was possibly because of him saving the two princesses on the floor of tests. Not to mention the obvious strength gap between them, now that he had ascended to a mid-sequence. Even at sequence 8, he was particularly stronger than any other regular, the princesses included. Now, let's just say he was a little bit stronger. Let's just say that. Anak specifically told me to not mention them and approach the topic as my own recommendation. Winston laughed a bit. She still seems to not keep you in her eye, huh? Shibisu harumphed. She cares about everyone in the team. It's just that she seems to respect you a lot more. Winston stayed quiet for a moment, silently watching the scenery below. Then, after a moment, he spoke. Perhaps we can take a little break. Yes. Shibisu pumped his fist in the air, seemingly happy. You seem awfully happy. Winston chuckled. Zarin stabbed ahead with his spear, the tip of his weapon moving like a phantom through the wind. His spear spun around in the air, making enchanting circular arcs with speeds that left after images in its wake, making it difficult to predict the next movements. He took a step and attacked from the flank with his leg, tearing through the air and stabbed ahead again, a motion that created a whistling sound, akin to a sonic boom. With that, he slammed the handle of his spear into the ground and wiped the sweat that had appeared on his head with a smile. Suddenly, a sound came from the side. Back to training already? We've only arrived onto this floor, the voice said. Zarin turned his head, finding Amon, who was heading towards him with a smile. He wore a dark black hoodie with purple embossment and dark black pants. Zarin scoffed. I was getting myself used to the greater Shinsu density. Ye ought to do the same, he commented with a mocking voice. Care for a spar? I certainly wouldn't mind. Amon smirked, and then, he pulled out a short sword from under his hoodie and adopted a combat stance. Where did you keep that? Zarin raised an eyebrow in surprise. Less talking, more fighting. Amon scoffed. With that, Zarin took on a ferocious disposition and readied himself for a clash. The hall they were in was a fully metallic one, somewhere between 200 to 300 meters large, both lengthwise and widthwise. There was also a second floor railing on the side walls, which housed a view to the outside through windows. There was no one in the training hall at the moment, leaving the hall to the two regulars. They stood in stillness for a moment, gazing silently at each other. And then, Zarin moved. With a powerful step, his body instantly covered a distance of several dozens of meters and stabbed ahead. The spear broke through the air without a shred of resistance. Amon sidestepped to dodge, however, the stabbing moving turned into a sweeping one, prompting him to hold up his short sword and block. Clang! Amon was thrown backwards into the air with a sonorous clash of metal. His feet skidded along a distance of 10 meters, and then, Zarin was atop him again. Sha! Clang! Shing! Shuen! Various sounds of metallic impacts rang out in the hall as both Zarin and Amon moved about with speeds hardly visible to the naked eye. Their motions were a monotonous blur of repeated clashes with each other. Clang! Zarin stepped onto the ground and jumped up into the air, narrowly dodging a slash from Amon. Then, taking a stance mid-air, the weapon red of battle in his hand was thrown with a single swing of his arm. Whoosh! Boom! The spear embedded into the ground below, making spider web-shaped cracks spread out from the metallic ground. Amon had already retreated backwards when the spear was thrown, avoiding the attack entirely. Zarin landed onto the ground, however, before he could retrieve his spear. Amon was already atop him. Amon swung his short sword in erratic movements, appearing incredibly disoriented. However, a trained eye would be able to tell that it was anything but. Zarin moved his body and blocked with his hands, intercepting Amon's hands before he could make a full swing. Then, he kneed him in the abdomen. Bam! However, Amon remained unfazed and even smiled. Then, with a tremendous effort of his muscles, Amon picked up Zarin and threw him right into the air, a full 50 meters away from him. A boisterous laugh couldn't help but escape his mouth. You've come a long way from simply getting beat up by us, he exclaimed. concentrating Yushinsu at your abdomen just before the impact. You mastered that trick earlier than expected. Amon's smile widened just a tiny bit, a change that wasn't easily visible. Then, he again took a combat stance and prepared to burst out in speed. A faint hue began to escape his skin, covering his body in a layer of illusory blue mist. GodWbnowel's research papers of the tower's weapons was one of the things that revolutionized the way Shinsu was perceived in the tower. It offered an explanation of widely seen phenomenon and commonly used attack strategies, and was widely available to the common populace. At the rich ones, since it was quite expensive. Of course, it wasn't possible go get it before the 20th floor, as the wider tower only opened up at that point for the regulars. However, after their team passed out from the second floor, Kun, the blue-haired fox, gave them a very peculiar gift. It was a copy of the book in its entirety, something that was also taken from GodWbnowel's treasury. It was something Winston actively made everyone study and utilized it widely in his own research papers. Tales from the Lake. Ashel's research did not include the various applications of Shinsu as a weapon, only covering how it behaved in a variety of situations and how it influenced the weapons widely utilized in the tower, which was expected as it was, above all, a research paper. However, Winston had found new ways to utilize Shinsu, one of which was the diffusion boundary. Zaren's eyes widened a bit in amazement as he overlooked Amon's body, which was quickly covered by a faint blue mist. He broke out with a toothy grin and a rambunctious laughter, getting increasingly pleased with his friend's progress. You even learned the diffusion boundary. Amon didn't say anything, only taking a single step forward. And so, boom, whoosh, sha! His figure rapidly vanished from its place, dashing all the way across the hall over to Zaren. In the eyes of any normal regular, he would have only appeared as a momentary blur appearing in the wind, with his speed reaching almost 70 meters per second. Ha 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 ha! Zaren laughed as they clashed in the air, his hands tightly holding onto the arms of Amon, preventing him from getting out a full swing. His eyes glowed for a moment, and then, even his own skin began to get covered by a faint illusory layer of blue mist. Chapter 46. Of the Tower's Weapons. Diffusion Boundary. It was something that was created by Winston by taking the relatively simple concept of Shinsu aggregation in higher concentration, affecting the flow of Shinsu in lower concentration. Although the technicalities of the art were admittedly not easy to understand as it contained several cases as to what could occur, Winston created a little something for each of them. To not get too lost in the intricacies and provide the simplest explanation possible, the art was basically flow control inside the body mimicking the flow control outside of the body. By simply branching out the Shinsu through one's body and push out of it, one can mimic how a wave controller could control bongs. It led to the creation of a layer of Shinsu on the outside of the skin, held together by strands of Shinsu that extended inside the body and therefore, requiring no higher focus and mastery than the normal body reinforcement. One only had to maintain the small connection to the outside Shinsu on the inside of their body, and the rest could inherently be controller. Boom! Sha! Crash! Explosive sounds and metal clashes rang out in the training hall as Zaren and Amon dashed from one end to the other, one with a red spear in hand while the other had a short sword. At one point in their clash, Zaren had managed to grab his spear back from the ground and was now able to contend with Amon with full power again. Clang! Shing! Clashes of metal and dense flares of red flashed as sparks flew off their weapons. Amon stepped onto the metallic ground, and with that simple movement, the ethereal blue aura around his seemed to grow denser. Boom! Cracks spread across the floor as his body dashed out with increased velocity. Zaren's eyes widened a bit seeing him dash straight at him. Holding up his spear horizontally in front of him, he blocked a sword strike aimed right at his chest. Clang! Zaren clicked his tongue and took a stance with his spear. Then, the aura around him also expanded to mimic Amon. The concept of a diffusion boundary was simple. It used the Shinsu's water properties, forming a layer around the user through which energy and force was dispersed and transferred. It was a concept inherently similar to the diffusion boundary that cells of the human lungs had, which allowed for exchange of gases. In the same way, making use of the different properties of Shinsu, it elevated the physical properties by drawing in the Shinsu from the environment, increasing the physical capabilities of the user indefinitely. This was made possible because in aggregates of higher concentration like a standard bong, Shinsu has an effect on aggregations of lower concentration, allowing the diffusion layer to draw in the Shinsu. Zaren and Amon clashed again, their clash sending shock waves through the air. Their physical capabilities had already far surpassed anything they could achieve by themselves at this stage, appearing several times stronger than a traditional Shinsu reinforcement. Naturally, there were limits of control. The more Shinsu that gets drawn in, the harder it is to maintain the diffusion boundary. But in the end, there was no other drawback. The increase in physical strength would not harm the body, as Shinsu would compensate for the same. Amon smiled at Zarin, and the diffusion boundary around him turned chaotic for a moment. It somehow extended outwards, turning into several small droplets of water that shot out at blinding speeds. Zarin stepped back, instantly retreating a full 100 meters. Then the spear in his hand was spun around, deflecting the hundreds of water droplets that had been shot at him. As the attack ended, Amon's Shinsu aura stabilized, appearing notably thinner. Zarin couldn't help but smile at this and rushed straight at him. Whoosh! His spear preceded him in reaching the target. Amon tried to block the attack with his short sword, however. Clang! The short sword flew right into the air, as did the spear that was thrown. And then, a sudden force met his face as Zarin's fist slammed right into it. Bam! Crash! Amon flew back and crashed into the walls of the hall, his expression confused and flabbergasted. He looked over at Zarin with astonishment. Seeing his expression, Zarin gave a smug smile. You've surely grown a lot. But you're a couple of centuries behind to think of defeating me. Zarin yelled, flexing his right bicep. Amon shook his head with a resigned sigh and a tug on his lips. Then, he got off. You have to admit, I had you in trouble for a moment, didn't I, Mr. Zarin? He asked. The man in question dodged and questioned and began to walk out of the hall. Let's get something to eat. Nothing like a good meal after winning. And a boisterous laugh accompanied his comment. Amon sighed again and followed behind him, shortly after picking up both of their weapons. However, just as they left, on the small balconies of the second floor, an ethereal figure turned visible. It was Winston Heath. His eyes held a calculating glint as he contemplated while holding his chin. Below him was nothing but a small disk of Shinsu. Amon is progressing faster than I expected. Then again, diffusion boundary is nothing short of an unfair tactic compared to anything else. He shook his head. The new Shinsu art allowed for not only usage of Bong-like Shinsu control and tremendous increase in physical capabilities, but it also accelerated the progress for future Bong creation. It could only be described as miraculous. Winston smiled and got up from his seat, the Shinsu disc below him vanishing into thin air. Then, he snapped his fingers. And there he was gone in a burst of flames. Winston walked back into his own personal room. They had booked a hotel at the 13th floor, one of the best. After all, if they were going to stay here for a break, they could not stay in a lackluster place. Of course, even if they weren't taking a break, they would still take the best hotels to stay. It was simply a matter of choice. As he walked into the room, his eyes couldn't help but travel outside through the windows which were unimpeded by the slight drizzle that marred their surface. A vast sea stretched out and scattered all around were various islands atop which towering builds stood to touch the sky. The clouds swaddled over the horizons as the afterglow of the evening and a bright golden body, the acolyte of light, the sun loomed halfway down the infinite blue, now stained with an orange hue, to welcome the black night. Winston couldn't help but smile as he gazed right at the setting sun. For with his eyes, he could see the hidden object that took advantage of the bright light. It was a lighthouse that loomed in the scintillating light of the evening, surely something organized by the tower's ruling parties to cull regulars in their infantile stages. This was something seen on every floor until now. The lighthouses were hidden in all sorts of places. Most of the time, there were multiple to cover the blind spots. And oh boy, did they have a gigantic view of the environment around them. Although Winston was unsure of how it could manage to analyze such a wide area as it did, he was sure the lighthouse could not analyze everyone all the time. His intuition told him so. And so, he stretched his body and calmly went to shower. After about 10 minutes and a change of clothes, he was back on his bed, calmly staring at the ceiling. Then, he got up and summoned the real inventory. He took out the ignition needle, cerulean tied and enveloped it with spirituality. Slowly but surely, the spirituality began to leak off the tip of the needle in waves and envelop the room in a blockade of secrecy and concealment. With that, Winston exhaled and sat cross-legged onto the ground. He closed his eyes and concentrated his spirit with cogitation. Then, lights began to appear around him. At first, there were 2, then 3, 4 and 5. Slowly, the number increased to 6 and even 7. 7 bongs. By someone on the 13th floor. However, it didn't stop at that point. Slowly, it increased and began to reach 8. The 8 bongs floated around him in a circle, slowly bobbing up and down in the air. Then, a 10th light began to materialize and then even the 11th. But as it did, the 10th light began to dim considerably. At that point, Winston opened his eyes and stared ahead at the 10 bongs. 10 is the current limit. The goal is to reach 12 before the 15th floor and before the next ascension. Winston thought with a nod. This was the main reason he had not been paying much attention to his own acting. The concept was that he would maximize his own Shinsu capacities before trying to ascend to the next sequence. As he understood it, drinking a potion to get to the next sequence enhanced his current talents. It was something that could be understood as a collective multiplication. Hence, it was the best decision to maximize his own potential before that. When Winston had been at sequence 8, the maximum bongs he could make was 3. When he ascended, the number was instantly boosted to 7. With a thought, the bongs were dispelled into thin air. Then, Winston suddenly had a strange expression on his face. He opened up the real inventory again and pulled out a variety of objects, each being completely random. One was a bottle of essential oil, some chalk, candles, and other strange trinkets. He pulled them out and laid them onto the floor before him. Then, he smiled. I suppose I can make some more charms. Of the Tower's Weapons, by Ashel Edwardu. Forward. Dear readers, a long time ago, King Zahard came into the uncivilized tower and taught the inhabitants civilization and ruled over them. He had said, "This place is too boggy." For us, who were born and raised inside the tower, it is a statement that makes no sense. But for the people outside the tower, the Irregulars, it is something they know very well. Surprisingly, there's no Shinsu in their world and something called air fills their world instead. They said that the tower filled with Shinsu is too boggy and uncomfortable for them. I have never seen air, but I have found out some commonalities and differences between air and Shinsu by interviewing the Irregulars. First, the common point is that they both let beings breathe. And they both flow constantly. It is also identical that they are powerful enough to threaten others when they flow harshly. Then the difference? The biggest difference is indeed the characteristics by the concentration. In Shinsu's case, it's more like a gas when it's in low concentration and more like liquid when it's in high concentration. But it seems air is not liquefied even in high concentrations. The second difference is the circulation. The circulation of Shinsu is very fluent, but there is no common law. And the movements are all different by the floors of the tower. But it is said that there are set laws in the circulation of air. I want to study some more about the laws, but the research is slow because none of the Irregulars that I have met is knowledgeable enough about the laws of air. The third difference is consumption. Shinsu exists everywhere inside the tower. So Shinsu exists even in a room that is completely sealed. Shinsu does not flow in from somewhere else, but is rather created from the tower. So, we can live in the sealed places. Air is not created from sealed places, and if a being is locked inside a sealed room, the being will consume all of the air and die. It seems very uncomfortable. You readers may not understand why I, who is not even a wave controller, am writing about Shinsu on the front pages of a book about weapons. But it is because you are ignorant of the weapons of the tower. Shinsu and the weapons of the towers are interrelated. You cannot fully understand the weapons unless you understand Shinsu. All of the weapons we use are modeled after the weapons from the outside of the tower, which Zahard and the 10 family heads brought in with them when they came inside the tower. Their weapons were, of course, all made to suit air, not Shinsu, even though some were used in a vacuum. They had to develop and modify their weapons to suit the properties of Shinsu. That's how the weapons we use were born. So it's essential to know about Shinsu to understand the weapons of the tower. For this reason, there are going to be a lot of stories about Shinsu in the following chapters, and I request that readers place special emphasis on the relationship between the weapons and Shinsu while reading. Part 4. Bongs and Concentration, a short extract. As per one of the research papers by GodWbnovel and my own personal experiences, Shinsu can sometimes concentrate itself into aggregations most often seen on the floors above 70. Such aggregations can affect the general flow of Shinsu in a lower concentration, leading to a regular phenomenon. An example of such is the higher aggregation attracting the Shinsu around the atmosphere, drawing it closer and turning denser, eventually turning into a large whirlpool that sucks in all the Shinsu around it. This is also one of the processes that leads to the formation of suspendium, the main component of inventories and lighthouses. In the opposite case, the Shinsu flow reverses from the higher to the lower concentrations, siphoning off the aggregation and leading it back into equilibrium. Chapter 47. Charms and Dreams. With an expressionless face, Winston arranged everything that he had pulled out of the inventory into a clean altar. The chalk had been used to draw a rough circle and cryptic symbols onto a paper parchment that had been spread about on the floor. A set of 3 candles was erected on the parchment on the right, and the various trinkets were kept in the center. It was an altar Winston had set up to pray to himself. Since he was praying only to himself, there was no need for any over-the-top preparations, like incense and essential oils. There was, however, a need to pinpoint his own place in the spirit world through the wall of spirituality. As such, a 3-line description needed to be constructed for him to mimic as a creature from the spirit world. Winston had spent a good time thinking over and finalizing his own descriptive titles, just to make sure it would not pinpoint something else in the tower. Taking his needle, he placed it at one side of the ritual altar and pulled out a blue coin, placing it on the other. Then, with a clear mind, he extended his hand and rubbed the wick of the candle. His spirituality extended, lighting the candles with a fluttering orange flame. He inhaled slightly, then spoke out. "Traveler from the further beyond," he said. The air around him stirred with an unseen breeze as a thick chill suddenly enveloped the environment. Winston felt his spirituality jump around and extend outwards in rhythmic waves, like ripples on the surface of a lake. "The thief of science," he said. And immediately, a sudden tremor traveled up his spine. Without stop, he continued. "He who dreams to rule over history." The entity named Winston Heath. Then, with the reciting of the honorific names done, he moved on. "I beseech you, bless upon these charms the power of your spells. I give you the cerulean tide, a weapon of ignition that belongs to you. I give you the suspendium coin, a trinket that belongs to you." He closed his eyes as he felt his spirituality turn chaotic and seep off into the spirit world. "Sanctify these charms in your name," he exclaimed, and with it, the charms placed in the center of the altar glowed with an otherworldly light. Faint whispers echoed across his ears as the room's temperature began to return, no longer feeling cold. Following that, he finished up the ritual and cleaned up the altar. After everything was said and done, he picked up the charms and laid onto the bed, feeling a bit lethargic. Sigh. Winston sighed, quietly musing over the ritual. The first part of his honorific name was to solidify his position as an irregular, but still, it left some loopholes that could pinpoint at some other existences which weren't irregulars. Then, the second part, the thief of science. It was to pinpoint himself as a man of science and an enthusiast of research. Even amongst the irregulars and the anomalies that the first line may have highlighted, the probability of anyone being a scientist was close to none. However, even if that were the case, the last line was the nail in the coffin. He who dreams to rule over history. It symbolized his future as a beyonder of the Fool pathway. And finally, he had manipulated the ritual, modifying it with a fourth line that directly corresponded to his name. It was only possible because Shinsu was so malleable in nature and the surrounding spirit world could offer its power with less rigid conditions. In essence, each of the lines did not all have to prompt him. It was fine as long as they all came together to pinpoint him, which was the approach he was going for. If he could be pinpointed at his level with a single line, he would not feel too safe at any time. The tower was full of danger, and for an irregular like him, it was especially fraught with traps and hidden enemies. In essence, the entire tower stood against him. And with how truly limitless Shinsu was, he would not be too surprised if someone could focus on his existence by reciting his honorific name, at least not until he was at a high enough sequence, and comfortable enough to take on high rankers. Speaking of which, he had also thought of the honorific name he would adopt at the higher sequence. Shaking out of these thoughts, he focused on the charms he had created. As of right now, he could make charms in 3 specific categories. First included his spells as a trick master. All of them could be imbued into a charms and activated at will. It was a good weapon to give to his teammates since he had no use for those. The second included his flame-controlling powers and illusion abilities. It allowed for the charm to burn through the opponent or make illusions that trick the opponent. Again, something that was more useful for his teammates than himself. However, it was the third kind that was somewhat useful. Well, kind of. The third type of charms included concentration charms and Shinsu charms. They constituted the ones Winston had some use of. The former allowed for better concentration of spirituality and Shinsu under stressful situations, making him able to generate more bongs that he would normally be able to. The latter was something akin to a Shinsu bomb, a weapon utilized on the upper floors by scouts and light bearers which have lower combat capabilities. The charms he could make as of right now were not too great, but they were at least operable. Him even being able to make charms of operational ability at his current level was solely due to him being far stronger than an average sequence 7. Winston yawned, feeling a bit sleepy. And so, he covered the windows with the curtains and headed off into the domain of dreams. Winston dreamt of an insurmountable mist, standing before him, above him, below him and behind him. The white, slightly gray mist covered everything in its way, to the point that he couldn't see anything even a meter ahead of him. His thoughts muddled by the dream, he walked ahead through the mist, walking and walking and walking and more walking. Endless walking. At the point where his legs seemed to scream out in pain and his ankles wanted to leap off his body for a moment of respite, he saw a thin, illusory figure appearing in the misty void. The figure, humanoid in shape, turned its head towards him. Winston felt a strange pull from the figure, and then slowly felt his thoughts coming to a standstill and melting down into a bulbous soup. His head caved in slightly and his eyes turned crimson. His spirituality he felt draining away and disappearing into the mist, as did his consciousness and rationality. Then, another figure appeared amid the void and extended its hand as well. Huff. Winston got up from the bed, his head and body all covered with sweat. He huffed, taking in large mouthfuls of air with his eyes wide open. Huff. What the hell? Huff. He spoke to himself, trying to make sense of the dream. In the empty and dark room, with the only source of illumination being the faint light of the artificial moon that filtered through the curtains, Winston sat in silence, pondering over the revelation. Come on, you twats. We must get the goods loaded up till sunrise. A loud yell rang through the air, shaking through the ears of everyone present. It was a giant with 4 arms, skin red as blood alongside eyes that were a clear white. His body donned great colorized attire, most of which seemed suited for battle. His head was bald, devoid of any hair, as was his face, with no eyelashes or eyebrows to speak of. He looked on towards the labyrinthine ship inside which giant containers were being loaded. The entire ship was composed entirely of metal alloyed with suspendium, allowing it to take bizarre or even eerie shapes. The walkways extended up into the air and curved in irregular patterns. The cabins glued to the side of the ship seemed to stack atop each other with such little space between them that it seemed to paint a dystopian feeling. The walls were all but covered with steam pipes that blew vapor into the air, as were the cabins. There was little light in the entire structure, with the only source of light being the orange glow of a tube light high up at the ceiling. The man's eyes traced the containers trailing towards the workers of bizarre shapes. The workers shrank their heads in surprise at his booming voice, which to them seemed to act as a danger signal. The red man's expression turned slightly happier as he watched the workers shrink back in fear. His dagger-like teeth showed through his mouth as a hollow chuckle escaped his lips. He shook his head, turning to head back into his cabin. However, just as he did, someone stopped him. It was a large blue blob with a darkened at its center. It climbed up the walkway and softly called out to the man. You, The man turned. Spit it out already. He yelled. The blue blob's color drained somewhat, not that it was even able to be discerned due to the low lighting. It was a reporter. A reporter from the 27th floor. We snuck onto the ship and was able to escape. Suddenly, the red man's body erupted into a brilliant red flame that enveloped the entire walkway they were on. Arf! A scream rang out in the air as the blob tried to jump off of the walkway. However, just as he did, a large hand slammed into him, holding him in place. Erg! The blob's agonizing screams continued for just another 3 seconds before they came to a standstill. The workers shrank further behind the containers, fearful of somehow catching the man's ire. The flames around the red man danced around for a bit before they disappeared back into his body. The blob which was at his grip just now was nowhere to be seen, already having been burnt to a crisp. The red man harumphed and turned back. Ye ought to find that reporter. I want him dead. Ye hear me? Dead. He yelled and disappeared into his cabin. As the man left, the temperature in the ship began to return to normal, a change that no one noticed had even happened. The workers quickly scrambled about. Their destination could not be guessed. Chapter 48. Intuition. The sun shone down onto the tall buildings of the 13th floor vacation islands. The entirety of Winston's team sat around the connected lounge on their floor. Dorsey and Anak were the only ones not present, opting to sit in the connected balcony to witness the new sunrise of the floor. The lounge was connected to an open kitchen in which Shibisu and Zarin were standing, their bodies adorned with cooking gloves and aprons. Winston, Amon and Lore were sitting on the sofas in front of the large television screen. Lore, as always, seemed to be lethargic. However, Winston too seemed the same, though not to the same extent. Winston yawned, holding a cup of warm water in his hands. You still seem sleepy, Mr. Winston, Amon quipped with a smile. Winston turned his head slightly and shook his head, simultaneously taking a sip from the cup. I couldn't sleep properly last night. Why? Bad dreams. You could say that. Amon nodded in enlightenment and turned to the television screen where some strange love drama between a ranker and a resident woman was unfolding. High Ranker's Last Love was the name of the drama. Winston watched the scene unfold with a deadpan. His expression was of such great uninterest that the creator of the drama would find it insulting. Without any change in his facial muscles, he picked up the remote and changed the channel, instead, switching to a news channel. Information was power. Even more so for a beyonder, though the impact may differ based on the pathways. As the channel switched, a mean-looking man with a broad forehead came on one half of the screen. The other half was covered by the picture of another man wearing a mask that covered the lower half of his face. The trafficking of suspendium and people that live in the middle tower has been uncovered by a reporter of ours. The reports tell of 2,000 tons of suspendium getting transported across 17 different ships, and close to 2 million people getting trafficked from the middle tower connecting to floors 13 to 18. The reports even suggest the involvement of FUG and one of the slayers in the issue. Winston raised an eyebrow at the statistics. But he knew such a number only seemed absurd to himself. The scope of the tower was much larger than Earth ever was, and each floor harbored hundreds of millions of residents. That wasn't even counting the outer tower, which had billions and innumerable kingdoms that operated at those scales. That's something, I suppose, Winston commented, drinking all the water from the cup and keeping it on the table in front. 2,000 tons of suspendium would easily amount to more than 300 million points. Lore chimed from the side. Winston turned to him, finding him wide awake at the news. Winston looked at him for a moment before he looked towards Amon. "What's your thoughts on this?" Winston asked. At least he wanted to ask, however. He stopped before the words could flow out of his mouth. Amon sat there, hands clenched to the full and eyes concentrated onto the television screen. His teeth were clenched hard and his expression seemed somewhat odd. Winston stared at him, all for but a moment. "Amon?" he called out softly. Amon didn't reply. "Amon?" he called out again. Suddenly, Amon broke out of his reverie and looked on towards him in surprise. "Huh? What?" he said in puzzlement. "What's wrong?" "Oh, nothing. Nothing's wrong." Amon chuckled and shook his head. Then, he got off the sofa and began to walk off. "I'll just be in my room. I'm feeling a bit sleepy now. Call me for training in the afternoon," he said and went away. Winston and Lore watched him leave without a word between them. Winston was never too great at connecting with people or figuring out their emotions. He wasn't some protagonist of a drama novel after all. That sole fact made him not speak out at that moment and watch Amon simply leave. He turned back towards the television, which at this point was broadcasting some other piece of news. Time passed. "You should talk to him." Lore spoke out suddenly. "Yeah, I probably should," Winston said with a low chuckle. "I'll do that afterwards," he declared. With that, he picked up the remote and switched the channel. Bam! A feminine figure flew out from a cloud of dust, landing into a large rock, destroying it in the process. And almost simultaneously, an annoyed voice called out, "God damn it! What the hell?" Dorsey cursed, her eyes taking on a scary expression. She looked towards her opponent, a dark-haired man wearing a white-colored t-shirt and pajamas. For footwear, he wore a pair of Crocs. Winston smiled at her, looking on without a word as she got up from the ground and collected herself. "I still can't get over how strong you've gotten already," Dorsey huffed, walking over with a defeated expression. Winston only shrugged his shoulders. "Cheer up. You'll get there sometimes. But you're too much of a freak of nature. You already have strength equivalent of a D rank regular." Winston raised a brow at her comment. "And what's the basis of your statement?" Dorsey, who was already within 10 meters of him, stopped for a moment to think over the question. Then, she chuckled. "I just said that on a rough understanding of the strength progression. As you are right now, no one can even hope to match you until the 40th floor. As I said, a freak of nature." Winston shook his head with smirk. "That's not very nice, you know." Whoosh! A piercing sound rang in the area as Winston tilted his head sideways, narrowly dodging a needle that was aimed at him. As he did so, he immediately extended his hand and grabbed onto the weapon. "Attacking while someone in the middle of a conversation," he said. Dorsey only laughed, rushing straight at him with the speed of a bullet. Without any other pleasantries to exchange between them, Winston ducked under a kick aimed at his neck, and then punched up towards Dorsey's abdomen. Shwoo! Bam! Dorsey, without anything to protect herself, was hit right in the stomach, throwing her back through the air. Dorsey groaned a bit in pain as she landed, rushing back at Winston with increased speed. Slowly, around her skin a transparent blue aura began to appear, rippling and bubbling in intricate patterns like clouds dancing in the blue sky. Winston only smiled as he met her. Both of them threw around a flurry of attacks, with Dorsey's meeting only empty air. "Way to go! Get that old woman!" yelled the two spectators from the side, Anak and Shibisu. Hearing their words, Dorsey felt a pang of annoyance swell in her heart. However, there was nothing that she could do. Before long, Dorsey lied on the ground, defeated. Anak cheered on the side, clapping as she did so. Winston shook his head and walked towards them. "You guys train for a bit. I'm going back," he said. They nodded and didn't ask anything else. As he walked along the outskirts of the island, he could not help but gaze at the horizon, where the sea and the sky met. The sun was high up in the air still, casting a warm blue glow all over. Then, he looked in the opposite direction where a gigantic architectural marvel stood tall, a building that towered at a staggering 700 meters. Without a word, he snapped his fingers. And gone was he in a blazing inferno. Individual limitations can compensate for favorable circumstances. It doesn't matter how much of a great situation you're in, doesn't matter how great of a present you have, doesn't matter how many people and what kind of people you've made friends with. If your own limits have marred your spirit and rendered you unable to move forward at full potential, it's all for naught. The world is a cruel place. Amon learned it the hard way, really. He never did have a great life at any point, which made the good moments stand out all the more. Sigh. He sighed as he sat in the shade of the balcony, staring out into the sky. He was having fun. Truly, he was. For a moment, he had once again found some people he wanted to believe in and stay with. However, that also bred fear. Fear of losing everything like he already had, 2 times prior. A man's greatest enemy is his own mind. Suddenly, the glass door behind him slid open with a loud noise, prompting Amon to look back. "Yo," said Winston with a relaxed smile and a lazy disposition. He walked into the balcony, sliding the door close as he did so. "You didn't come to train?" he asked, taking a seat right beside him at a chaise chair. "You didn't call me, Mr. Winston?" Amon's reply came quickly, along with a chuckle. "You don't usually miss any training. Is there something I should know?" Winston raised a slight brow, looking at him through the corner of his eye. Amon stayed silent for a small moment. "I'm not sure if I understand what you're talking about. You appeared somewhat disoriented after watching the news earlier today. Is there something you'd want to tell me?" Winston pushed for an answer. Truthfully, he had thought of a variety of options. It could have been a family member that was trafficked from his family somewhere before, or he himself that was done so. Naturally, he thought of some other possibilities too, but the two were the most probable. He could use dream divination to get an instant answer from the spirit world, but he felt that hearing the answer from Amon himself would be better. If he didn't want to tell him, then only would he resort to using divination. The main reason was that Winston had never fully trusted his divination abilities after the incident at the 2nd floor. And he wouldn't do so in the future, at least not till he reached sequence 4. That didn't mean he entirely shunned its use. In fact, he made side use of it every day. However, in terms of sensitive information like ones related to his teammates, he would only trust a divination after getting some sort of confirmation from his intuition. His intuition had become his main source of confidence in terms of divination. Amon looked away, staring back into the void for a moment. Then, he smiled. "It's pretty pathetic, really. I didn't lead a great life until I came into the tower. I used to live in the resident area of the tower and was quite happy." Amon began. "However, when I was 12, I was abducted by a group of traffickers and taken somewhere. Although I managed to escape, I forever lost contact with my family." Winston listened on without interrupting, providing Amon a place to vent. "After that, I wandered around the unknown area for 3 months, finding scraps to survive. Luckily, a group of thieves took me in and taught me how to steal to survive. However, before I entered the tower, they were all killed." Amon looked over towards Winston, who, upon sensing his gaze, met his eye. His eyes were somewhat dull in color, yet they appeared deep. "We made a heist we weren't supposed to. That day, I lost myself another family." He broke out with a warm and compassionate smile. How he smiled like that when talking about loss, Winston could somewhat understand. He himself had also lost the old man who took him in. Although he hadn't watched him get slaughtered in front of him, loss was loss. Amon seemingly reminisced about the good moments he had spent, fleeting vistas that remained as nothing but illusory memories in his mind. "I met you guys and sort of forgot? I forgot how easy it was to lose everything." He folded his legs before him and hugged his knees. "I was happy again. And then, suddenly I was reminded of it again. I don't even know how I could take my mind off of it in the first place." He laughed a bit. The environment descended into silence. Winston sat with Amon, not speaking a word, not even moving. It continued on for a minute, the silence persisting throughout. Winston. Well, he didn't know what to say. Actually, he did. Sort of. But he didn't wish to do so. Suddenly, He got up and walked over to the balcony door and slid it open. "Get yourself together," he said, turning to Amon with a compassionate stare. "You aren't a kid anymore. You lost people dear to you. I understand that. However, you move on. Simple as that. Waiting around and dwelling on what's past won't help it." Walking into the room, he spoke again. "Believe me. I know." With that, he closed the door and walked away into the kitchen. Rummaging around the drawers for a bit, he pulled out some biscuits to eat and headed out of the kitchen. And then, that didn't go too well. Winston heard Lore mutter. He looked towards the sofa where he was laying down. "Aren't you supposed to be asleep? I shouldn't have told you to talk to him. I should have told Shibisu instead. I didn't talk to him because you said so. He's my friend now," Winston declared. "Well, you didn't do a very good job. I thought you'd offer some kind of great speech," Lore said, yawning as he did so. "Amon isn't a kid," Winston said with conviction. "He doesn't need anyone to validate his own life. He doesn't need some glorious speech to help get over the loss of his friends and family. If he wishes to find purpose and a reason to move forward, he'll have to do that himself." Suddenly, Lore got up from the sofa, staring right at Winston. Maybe he just needed some words of encouragement. "A hope," he said. Hearing his words, Winston was silent for a moment, staring right at Lore. He held his chin, contemplating quietly. "Maybe that's just you, sympathizing a bit too much with that boy," he said, and went right back to sleeping. Winston stood alone in the hall. His eyes unconsciously traveled to the balcony, staring at the back of Amon's head. Chapter 49. Shenanigans. Winston put a biscuit into his mouth, chewing quietly. Suddenly, a thought arose in his mind, and with it a gleam in his eyes. It was a sudden realization, stemmed from his intuition. The ships are transporting such a large amount of suspendium along with a large amount of people. If I can somehow get even 1,000 people outside and save them, wouldn't that technically count as enhancing my talent towards the next sequence of the error pathway, Prometheus? As Winston understood from the name of the next sequence, the acting principle followed something along the lines of stealing something for the benefit of others. Though he couldn't be sure of it, as acting always required experimentation. However, by the Greek legends, Prometheus stole fire from the gods to give to humans, suffering by himself in the process. It stood to good reason that a sequence named after the legendary figure would follow through with his actions. In the future, I wouldn't be able to move as freely due to the floors getting more congested with forces of the 10 great families. Eventually, rumors might spread about my strength, and the possibility of being suspected as an irregular is always there. Though at that point, I would be a faceless, a movement would be a lot easier. It's better to enhance my talent to begin with. Moving through with the acting of a higher sequence now itself ought to have great returns in the future. Not to mention the feedback I would receive upon successfully completing the task would be enormous. However, that's easier said than done. Since the ships were carrying such a large assortment of goods, it was logical for Winston to assume that they had at least one ranker on board. And since the news of them had been revealed recently, it also seemed logical to conclude that reinforcements would arrive to strengthen the ships, meaning even more rankers to deal with. As strong as Winston was at the moment, he doubted he could take on a full-fledged ranker. Not to mention the foreign territory, the possibility of other forces intervening, and the obvious unknown factors in the narrative made it all more difficult than it should be. Naturally, it would not be an issue if Winston was of a higher sequence. Indeed, if I was at sequence 6, I would not be too worried about it. Whatever. There's nothing that can be done. Winston thought for a moment. He walked around aimlessly through the hallways of their floor. As the biscuits in his hands vanished one after the other and an empty packet was left behind, he had decided on a course of action. Popping his neck, he headed back into his room to attempt a divination. A lone man walked along a seemingly deserted street. The desolate buildings on either side, coupled with a slight drizzle that poured down from above, shaded the scenery in a shadow of melancholy. The man stood at a staggering 7 feet tall, a height not too rare in the tower. His skin was white as snow and his piercing red eyes shone with a baleful glare. He held a smile on his face and a black suitcase to his side. Some beggars and ruffians walked along the sides, their numbers in the dozens throughout the entire walkway. Everyone seemed to ignore him, as if he did not exist at all. Eventually, he made his way to a dock which softly kissed the sea and at the base of which waves crashed into in rhythmic movements. The man's smile widened perceptibly as he gazed out into the sky, seemingly looking through the thick overcast and into the unknown. "What do you think?" he asked, seemingly to no one. However, suddenly, from out of his trench coat, an elongated creature that looked eerily like a snake crawled out. Its face was like a turtle while the elongated body held rough, turtle shell-like scales. Looking at the sky, the turtle spoke out with a hoarse voice. "It's just clouds." The man chuckled softly and extended his hand upwards, the one that held the suitcase. The suitcase floated in the air as he opened it and took out a strange stone. Then, closing the suitcase and holding it by his side again, he threw the rock ahead of him. Ripple. The sound of a ripple rang out in the air as the stone-like object disappeared into the air. Then, the air shimmered with a plethora of colors, and with it, a vision overlapped the air. It was a gigantic ship that hovered above the clouds, at the bottom of which highly pressurized steam was getting ejected out of. "And what of it?" the snake asked. "I sense a disturbance with it. So we're here to check what it would be," he replied. "Is it more important than the previous one?" "More or less. I suspect it might even be connected, since every disturbance so far has originated from the same point." The snake bobbed its head up and down, nodding in understanding. "I see," it said and retreated back into the trenchcoat, away from prying eyes. The man shook his head and held down onto his top hat. Then, taking a single step forward, he let himself drop into the water. Shia! Winston found himself in a hazy dream. He saw visions, scattered information from the spirit world traveling through his mind. It was a surreal sensation every time he experienced it. Dream divination always left himself feeling as if he was floating. Floating and floating and free and floating. Like a will-o-wisp. Like a leaf in the wind. Like a fish in an endless ocean. A large fleet of metallic battleships floated in front of his eyes, hovering above a gigantic ocean of clouds that poured down rain below. Below the ships was a tube through which pressurized steam was ejected down, which made the clouds that rained water below. Then, suddenly, he zoomed further, somehow looking inside the ships. The labyrinthine structure of metallic paths and containers that floated in the air, with strange humanoid creatures prowling about. Of such strangeness was their visage that they seemed more like untamed beasts than any civilized creature. And of such ferociousness was their disposition that one could only ever associate them with the brutes that knew of nothing but violence. Yet, here they prowled along with such sleekness and quiet that they seemed to be almost fearful. The entire vision was scattered and broken, appearing increasingly odd. This was the result of blindly attempting a divination. Without any information, it was nothing short of a miracle that Winston was even able to get a response in the first place. Divination was all about association of information. It couldn't be attempted without any anchorage. The only reason he was even able to get a response was that information flowed uniformly throughout the spirit world, that was Shinsu. There was nothing to block that information because it existed because of Winston's divination in the first place. He drew out information that was transported directly to him. Unlike the world of Lord of Mysteries where the spirit world was chaotic and non-uniform, Shinsu was far better in terms of conduction of information and performing divination. Once again, it was proved to be a source of power with limitless potential. The labyrinthine inside of the ship was memorized by Winston at a single glance, courtesy of improved memory provided by the Fool Pathway. Then, he broke out of the hazy dream. He inhaled sharply as he got up. His eyes were a mix of quiet contemplation and annoyance, yet no other expression could be seen on his face. It was completely blank. He sat around for a few minutes, completely still. Then, suddenly, a gleam appeared in his eyes and he smiled. Time for some experimentation. "What are you thinking?" A feminine voice came from behind Amon. He looked back from the sunset, finding a green-skinned girl staring at him. In her hands, she held a soft drink. Just staring at the sunset. Amon smiled sweetly at her. Anak nodded and sat down beside him. The sand beneath her shifted slightly as her tail swept through it. The crimson hue made by the sun shone through the sky, covering the environment with an orange glow. Both of them sat in silence for a moment, quietly watching the scenery. Suddenly, Amon spoke. "Ms. Anak, do you enjoy watching the sunset?" Anak turned her eye towards him. She paused for a moment before she said, "Every evening, me and my mom used to sit outside of the house to watch the sunset." She turned her head, taking a sip from the drink. "What about you?" Amon smiled softly. "I don't remember much about my parents anymore. It was a long time ago." Anak continued to stare at him. "I remember my dad was tough on me, though my mom always saved me from his beatings." Amon chuckled softly. "He wanted me to be a better man. Someone stronger. But now that I look back at it, he just wanted the best for me." Anak stilled for a moment, then, she looked up at the sky. "He was a cook, my dad." She continued. "My mom loved his cooking. Every other day, he would make chicken pies. We all ate it together. My mom used to fight him quite a lot though. That sounds nice. Amon closed his eyes for a moment. At that time, he felt something on his cheek. Opening his eyes, he saw Anak pushing the soft drink can onto him. Here you go, she said. Amon took a hold of the can, looking at her in puzzlement. Anak shook her head and got up from the ground with a smile. Be back before dinner, she said, walking off. Amon looked at her back as she walked farther and farther, his face a mix of puzzlement and slight surprise. He took a look at the soft drink, then back at Anak. With a sigh, he took a sip from the can. Winston sat in his room, which was darkened through the curtains that blocked all light from the sunset. The only source of illumination in the dimly lit room was the group of candles lying on the ritual altar, and an ominous blue ball of water that floated above. Winston had his eyes closed and his hands stretched out, manipulating the bong before him, filling it further and further with shinsu. On his skin glistened a transparent bluish aura, the diffusion boundary. Softly, he called out. Traveler from the further beyond. The thief of science. He who dreams to rule over history. The entity called Winston Heath. Then, moving on from the reciting of honorific names, he said, I beseech you, bestow a part of you to this conduit I hold. Provide a projection of your soul and essence. Share it with me through this conduit. I ask you for your astral form that contains a shred of your power. I give you, cerulean tide, a weapon of ignition that belongs to you. I give you the suspendium coin, a trinket that belongs to you. Heed my call. As Winston finished, faint whispers began to fill the air around him, echoing through his ears and into the unknown infinity. In his eyes, the shinsu all around turned chaotic and heavier, getting dragged towards the large bong he had created in front. Then, something clicked. Suddenly, he felt as if his astral projection had traveled, not completely, but it did still. It was something of the sort that mimicked watching two different movies on two different screens. Focus was incredibly inefficient. And just then, he felt his spirituality reserve get cleaved in half. The shinsu ball before him trembled and bubbled, tumbling around in the air as if life had suddenly been injected into it, and it pranced around aimlessly like a headless chicken. As it happened, Winston finished up the ritual and got up. His eyes flashed with a plethora of colors that glowed eerily in the dark. The shinsu ball before him, just now that floated silently, began to morph. An illusory air began to fill it and appear in his eyes as a man. It was another Winston Heath. Winston chuckled. Then, he burst out into laughter. The Winston that stood before him too burst out into a fit of cheerfulness, both of them displaying nearly identical features and antics. Chapter 50. Mysteries. Flames danced around the edges of the clouds, gently kissing the metallic surface of a mechanical behemoth that rose slowly above the misty canopy. The slightly dirty color of the clouds and the reddish-orange flames tinted the metal of the ship with a strange hue, not unlike that of a sparkling piece of aluminum. On the deck of this large mechanical floater, one of the ships that carried people off to unknown destinations, stood a tall and imposing red-skinned man, his eyes holding a ferocious look resembling that of a brute. His disposition, so alien and unlike anything a civilized person could have, was still gazing down through a gap in the clouds towards the middle tower. Once again they had done one of their missions. 100,000 people this time, 30,000 of which were fresh children. The man looked on down as the rain poured under the clouds, drenching the ground under. However, without warning, he turned his head to the right, eyes narrowed as if searching for something. The flames that danced at the edges of clouds stirred, as if beckoned by a call, and reacted dynamically, exhibiting life-like behavior. Looking in the same direction for some time, he shook his head, later walking back inside. The flames in the clouds continued to dance for a few more moments before they began to dim out. However, just then, one of the embers exploded into a blazing pyre. Shaya! The yellowish-orange flame exploded into a fire of predominantly red color, mixed in with a tinge of orange. The flames that exploded continued to dance as if they had been possessed, slowly drawing closer to the mechanical floater. And as it did, a foot extended from the flame. Step. The footstep, although not at all loud and even inaudible due to the plethora of other noises in the air, seemed to echo particularly more than everything else. Following the footstep, a full man emerged from the flames, Winston Heath, wearing a full white mask on his face, one that let no feature go uncovered. His shoes were slightly higher, making him appear taller, along with filling shinsu through his clothes to make him appear more muscular than he was. And lastly, he wore tightly fitting robes, akin to a magician, and a pointed top hat. He walked with a slight limp in his steps, appearing somewhat crooked in his gait, and held a cane in his left hand, the sign of a fine gentleman. His skin, from the bits that could be caught from his hands and exposed ears, were of a darker tone, different from Winston's usual skin color. It was, in essence, the perfect disguise Winston could come up with considering he had not yet become a faceless. However, even without that, his current disguise coupled with the ability to change his voice through effective muscular control of the magician and the illusion abilities of the fool and error pathways, he could effortlessly hide his actual identity. Not that it would matter, but Winston was never one to take too many risks. The man with the crooked gait, Winston walked along, reaching the gate through which he was supposed to enter. Stopping just before it, he looked around himself. So high up, reaching here was surely not something Winston could achieve solely through flaming jump. Instead, what he had accomplished was flight. Compressing Shinsu under oneself to make a platform was easy enough, but 99.9% of regulars are unable to fly before reaching the 90th floor, with only the prodigies and wave controllers being able to do so. Why? It was not a simple matter of Shinsu control or how much strength one could attain through that. The thing was the flow one had to follow to achieve flight, fighting against said flow and being able to suspend oneself with the flow. It couldn't be achieved through simple Shinsu sensing, as that was just observing the surroundings using Shinsu. One had to see the Shinsu itself to move along with it or fight against it. Only at the higher floors would regulars understand the flow of Shinsu, though still not able to see it. But what about Winston, who could skip all that with his spirit vision? He could of course achieve flight. Though the rain and other factors made it somewhat difficult to maneuver, that could be remedied by making a platform to stand on, and making the said platform move through the air instead. And so, he had simply flew up to the clouds and used the flaming jump to approach the ship in one fell swoop. Efficiency at its peak. Naturally, finding the ship itself wasn't the tricky part due to spirit rod dowsing. The tricky part was actually making his way onto the middle tower. Their sceneries on the way were strange to say the least. Without any more delay, Winston passed right through the metallic door. The door pathway was indeed great for sneaking into places. As he did so, a superstructure of metal pathways, containers and rooms unfolded before his eyes. It was something he had already seen through spirit vision and dream divination, yet seeing it here made no less of an impression. He stopped for a moment, his figure turning illusory and disappearing into the air. Now invisible, he looked around. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of containers were laying about on the ground and floating high up in the air, all of them filled with people and children as he could see. Some of the containers held nothing but suspendium and were bound to the ground using complex chain networks. And amid all of these, were workers. Lots and lots and lots and lots of workers. Most of them were humanoid, but many were not, appearing increasingly alien when compared to anything Winston had ever seen. Winston didn't bother with any of that and simply moved forward through the walkways. His goal? Well. Samuel suddenly perked up, turning his head down and smiling as he sat atop the floating ship. It has begun. He softly muttered to himself. What are you waiting for then? A voice came from under his coat. Samuel chuckled and held down his top hat as he stood up, his tailcoat fluttering wildly in the wind. I suppose it's about time for me as well. Winston, under the guise of invisibility, walked through the walkways, exploring the entire ship bit by bit. The entire ship was of a size comparable to 30 football fields stacked end to end lengthwise and 10 football fields widthwise. Not to mention the plethora of floors it held. It was a gigantic labyrinth of twisting metal paths and never-ending workers and steam pipes to the sides. The gravity, too, was weird in the ship. Some walkways, while mostly horizontal, steeped straight up vertically, and the gravity followed suit, changing as per the needs of the road. The turns on the walkways were too eerie to make sense of. It was a random mesh of twisting straight paths, some turning at every 5 meters, while the other continued on the entire length of the ship. Strangely enough, none of the paths ever intersected each other save for the ones that hugged the walls and the steam pipes. Steam pipes were also many, lined along the lines of the tracks and under them. As for why they were specifically steam pipes, Winston wasn't sure. He theorized the structure to be running predominantly on liquid Shinsu, which would also explain the reason the steam could be ejected out to cover the ship while it flew. Maneuvering around the workers would prove to be difficult if he wasn't so agile due to the clown and magician potions. Of course, the strange structure helped a lot in movement, however paradoxical that may sound. Walking around, he kept his spirit vision active, constantly observing everything. The people in the containers all expressed a collective emotion. Sadness, fear and confusion. There were some that displayed more, but these were the most dominant. As for the workers, the only real emotion he could detect from them was an overwhelming desire to work. Just that. Complete the work as fast as possible. A desire that was fueled by fear. What could make them have such fear? Winston understood it. It was the rancor, the red-skinned brute that controlled flames. As he walked, he came across the various engine rooms of the ship. Something he took the time to observe quite clearly. However, after 3 hours of scouting out the ship and remembering all the spots where the people and the suspendium was being kept, he came across the room of the red-skinned ranker. Truthfully speaking, Winston had initially thought he would come across more rankers, seeing how the news of the ship was leaked and there was supposedly threat from the ruling classes of the tower. However, that thought was quickly shaken up into oblivion. Why? It was the large red symbol of 3 eyes in a triangular formation embossed onto the metal walls. Jihad's crest. At that moment, Winston had been made well aware that this was not, in fact, a FUG operation. It was carried out by Jihad's own forces. Winston silently watched the blood-red crest on the wall and started walking away, not before taking another look at the room the ranker had occupied. There were a variety of emotions he could see, but nothing particularly pointed itself out to him. Then, just as he was about to walk off, he suddenly stopped. Something's wrong. His eyes narrowed dangerously as he looked around himself, feeling a threatening glare suddenly lock onto him. It was not to be said where the glare came from, but he could feel hostility suffusing out into the surroundings. His intuition was truly overpowered. Just as he was racking his brain, his hair suddenly stood on edge and his eyes shrank into needles as a vision suddenly overwhelmed his senses. He saw himself, standing with his crooked gait enveloped by orange flames that sprouted out from behind him. Then, Shahia! Winston jumped, a mountain of fire erupting behind him. Boom! Jara! An explosion sounded, the ship trembled and the workers all shook on their feet. Winston landed onto the ground and looked back at the fire. There was a dancing silhouette in the flames, one that looked roughly humanoid. Then, from the heated air, walked out the red-skinned ranker, his 4 arms appearing particularly threatening, one of which held a black-colored hook. The illusion around Winston slowly withered away, leaving him visible. Too scared to barge right in, wasn't ya? How did you know? Winston asked, his voice unusually hoarse and deep. The red-skinned man scowled and clicked his tongue. Ye think of me as some idiot? The ranker yelled. And with that, his skin lit up with orange-red flames, spreading out in the blink of an eye. Shahia! Whoosh! Snap! As the flames approached him, Winston snapped his fingers with a crisp sound, disappearing from his place by submerging within the fire. The ranker's eyes widened a bit as he watched Winston disappear into the flames, but then, his gaze hardened unusually. With a hook in his hand, he violently swung behind him where lay still a last few pyres of fire. And from those same flames arose Winston. As Winston appeared out of the flames, his body bent at an impossible degree, something that would have torn his muscles and deeply injured all his joints, tearing his tendons and ligaments aside. His back bent inwards as he leaned back while mid-air, narrowly dodging the attack aimed right at his torso. A magician's ability to soften bones only aided the impossible flexibility they had. Boom! The attack cut through a large arc behind him, smashing right through the metallic hull of the ship and making a gigantic gash. Winston looked behind him in some foreboding. Then, he slowly turned towards the ranker. Yous are somewhat useful. Say what? Why don't ye work for me? The red brute smiled with his crooked teeth, making Winston almost frown. Almost. From beneath his mask came his deep and hoarse chuckle as he spoke. Why do you think I sneaked in here? It certainly wasn't to join your little game of pass the goods. And now that I've figured out this operation is run by Jihad, I doubt you'll simply let me go, he said. Though, he still wasn't completely convinced of the ship being Jihad's property. FUG or any other group could easily just emboss the symbol onto the ship for framing someone else. So, although he was 98% sure, he didn't eliminate the possibility of the ship belonging to some other organization. The red brute clicked his tongue in annoyance. Ah man. Then, his eyes suddenly seemed to glow with a baleful glow, appearing increasingly eerie in the brightly lit room covered partially with flames. Looks like I'll just Ave ta kill ya. And along came his maniacal smile. Chapter 51. Mysteries 2. Winston passed right through the metallic walls, escaping from the rampaging brute behind him. The metal behind him melted, and out came a raging maniac, swinging around a large black hook with one of his 4 arms. Stop runnin', ye thief. The air rippled from the heat as steam inside the pipes began to heat up more and more, expanding until it began to leak right out of them. The metal pathways began to turn into fluids, taking the form of molten metal. Winston looked at all of this with a smile as he gauged the level of the rancor. There was only one thing he could think. Powerful. Strong. Overwhelmingly so. The moment he got close without flame resistance, he would be burnt to a crisp. Not to mention the physical attacks and speed of the rancor. The only reason he was alive still was due to flaming jump, paper figurine substitution, and door opening. If not for these, he would have already been reduced to nothing but ash on the floor. Winston's smile widened for some inexplicable reason, yet it could not be seen from under his mask. The workers all around, that came in all shapes and sizes, scrambled around as a blaring alarm started in the ambience. The entire ship flashed red, more than it had already been due to the fire. Suddenly, Winston turned back, looking straight at the ranker. His eyes scanned the hook he held in his hands. It was by no means an ordinary weapon. His marauder intuition told him that much. But more than that, the spirit world provided him with the information he needed. The hook wasn't an ignition weapon, but it was perfectly made to move through the higher desi-ties of Shinsu, like the one found on floor 100 and above. And so, that was the reason. Winston wanted it. Boom, boom, boom. The sound of 3 sonic booms echoed in succession as Winston used air bullet. The columns of air rushed through the giant wall of fire and rushed at the ranker. However, before they could reach him, the heat scrambled them around, making only a light breeze reach the ranker. Without wasting any time, Winston's body was enveloped by flames. The ranker clicked his tongue seeing the display. That again? He yelled and began to rush ahead, no doubt thinking that Winston would appear further away. However, suddenly, he froze. His eyes widened, sensing someone within a meter's distance from him. Without hesitation, he swung behind him, aiming to take the head of anyone that dared to get close. However, the slightest expression of surprise he had expressed gave way to a momentary time gap. That gap was all that was needed. The ranker's hand grasped air. There was no one before him anymore. He blinked, opening and closing his hand in succession, and wondering whether he was a dream. However, Winston's voice interrupted his reverie. "Looking for something?" said the crooked voice. The ranker turned back, looking at the intruder, and in his hand, he found a familiar hook. "You!" The ranker spat out, the flames around him getting more restless. "It ain't my fault you didn't have a good enough grip." Winston laughed, summoning his armed inventory and keeping the hook inside it. The ranker wasn't one to stand around and do nothing. The air trembled and heated up further. The metallic paths all around turned into vapors as a sea of flames appeared in the compartment Winston and the ranker were in. And then, boom! Shaya! Whoosh! A gigantic hole was blown right through the ship, taking out the entire bottom portion of the mechanical floater alongside it. Thousands of compartments fell down, some burning in the gigantic pyre that permeated the air. Winston stared at the ensuing destruction as he walked out of the flames completely unscathed. The clouds below disappeared as the flames overwhelmed them with heat, making way for the ship to be seen from below. Winston's eyes then traveled upwards. But then, a vision overlapped with his senses. It was himself, in a state of free fall. Then, a fist tore through his head before he could even react. Winston's hair stood on edge. He tilted his head in mid-air and balls of light appeared around him. Whoosh! Boom! 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 The balls of light, bongs that numbered 11, all rushed straight at the ranker whose attack had been dodged. As one would think, the bongs dissolved into Shinsu before they could scratch even a single cell on the ranker's body. On the contrary, Winston, who was still falling below the ranker, crumbled down, appearing like a torn paper. And then, his body was suddenly ripped into shreds, scattering into bits that soon burst into flames. The ranker raised an eyebrow. He looked up where a soul man stood atop a transparent disc of Shinsu. "Ye have plenty of tricks up your sleeve, eh?" the ranker said. Winston didn't say anything, only prepared himself for the next clash, for he could feel that the ranker was no longer playing around. Winston's head turned clearer and his eyes turned focused. His spirit vision pierced through the thick fumes of fire around the ranker, taking in the Shinsu flow around him. There was only one phrase he could describe it as: chaotic. There was no flow to it whatsoever, it was completely chaotic and disordered, meaning he was only depending on his intuition for dodging. He exhaled, and with that, the destruction started. Winston immediately crumbled into bits of paper that soon caught on fire. Appearing some 100 meters away from his location, transparent wings, shaped like mechanical angel wings, materialized behind him to keep him afloat. "Ye can't even float properly. What balls do ya, Ave, to raid a ship I protect?" the ranker yelled out, and Winston again crumbled into paper as a wave of fire swept over him. Appearing another 100 meters away, Winston looked back. The ship was sailing in the opposite direction from them. However, that was not what Winston looked at. Instead, it was a strange man, somewhat 7 feet in height, that stood atop the ship and waved out to him. His eyes shrunk down into needles as he took in the figure of the man. It was the same person that he had encountered in the test. And with his presence came a sudden realization. The man atop the ship smiled at him, and in response, he narrowed his eyes, staring at him with open hostility. This man was the reason he had been discovered by the ranker. His intuition told him so. Something was wrong with this man's presence here. And he was not one to wish to find out. The moment Winston had an opportunity, he would kill that man. Just as he thought that, his body was overtaken by flames. Only this time, he completely dissolved in them and appeared again 100 meters in the other direction. As he did so, Winston rushed at the ranker with wild abandon. The ranker, seeing his target charging at him, smiled maliciously with a maniacal grin. Winston snapped his fingers, utilizing flaming jump and flame control to gain temporary immunity to the fire. Then, taking out a silver sword, he began to duel the man in the sky. Boom! 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 Whoosh! Shaya! Explosions rang out in the air along with hundreds of sonic booms as blows rained from both sides. Winston's sword expressly cut through the flames and air alike, while the ranker, being bare-handed, matched Winston in terms of ferocity and speed, perhaps even surpassing him. Winston had already taken note of the disadvantages he was at. He could not truly express his full strength. Diffusion boundary would be blocked as the Shinsu was too chaotic to gather in a stable layer around him. Any bongs he made would be ignited the moment they formed. And with how dangerous the flames were, Winston had to keep repeating flaming jump, slowly but surely slashing down his Shinsu and spirituality reserves just with that. There was little he could do to counter the ranker. Even with the sword, his attacks dealt little damage. The Shinsu reinforcement of the ranker far outclassed his own, a fact that he saw through immediately. It was not even a matter of finesse or technique. It was simply a matter of volume. The amount of Shinsu the ranker could utilize at once was more than 10 times his own, further putting him in a tough spot. And so, despite all of this, why did he choose to rush at the ranker instead of retreating? What was bubbling up inside that mind of his that he would take such a great risk? Whoosh! 4. Winston ducked under another punch from the ranker and snapped his fingers, disappearing in the fire that burned around them. The fire had already turned into a gigantic ocean above the clouds, making all the rain clouds disappear and leaving a singular sphere of red and orange hanging in the sky. The ship had drifted off amid their clash. Evidently, the workers did not wish to get caught up in the crossfire. Winston crumbled down into paper as he accidentally took a hit right to the chest and appeared some distance away. He slashed at the ranker, an attack that was ignored and countered. He vanished in a puff of fire again. Stop disappearing! The ranker yelled in rage. Just then, everything ceased. Hee hee! A low chuckle permeated the sky, overwhelming the sound of the crackling flames all around and ringing directly in the ranker's ears. He turned back, looking at the illusory figure of Winston that had appeared. Then, the figure began to fade away into a blur, leaving behind nothing but a blob of Shinsu that soon disappeared due to the fire. There was silence for a moment. Nothing but stillness in the ranker's eyes as the fire calmed down and retreated back into his body. Whoosh! Then, his body rushed out without weight, heading right towards the direction the ship had headed towards. Here, another low chuckle sounded in his ears, making his eyes turn a shade of crimson red. Chapter 52. Mysteries 3. The Error Pathway's Angel Ot Desiat, Amon, an acolyte of all things wrong and the thief of destiny, who stands as one of the most feared existences below the true gods in the Lord of Mysteries universe. Fallacy of fate. The Trojan horse of destiny. The slug of time. The reason for his infamy was due to many reasons. He could simply, on a whim, decide to steal your destiny, your identity and your existence. Anyone you have ever known, all your family members, all your loved ones and acquaintances will refuse to acknowledge your existence, seeing him as you. All the while you get sidelined, losing even the ability to be acknowledged by the people you so cherished. The worst part? He could simply pull it off to prove a point, or play a harmless little prank. However, that stood to be only one of the reason he was so feared. If there was one Amon near you, there wasn't. There were hundreds of him, perhaps even thousands of him. He could be anything. A member of your family, a beloved friend, the birds in the sky, even the bacteria in the air could be replaced by Amon. If you could see Amon, you were the target. If you couldn't, you were most likely the collateral. The ability to make avatars, autonomous version of him at his own wishes. An ability that defined the error pathway. The ability of a true virus and a bug. Multiplication to infinity. And that was something Winston Heath, at this moment, managed to make a cheap imitation of with Shinsu. Of course, the true ability was still too far away from his hands. He could not even copy a sliver of its true power, but it was still shocking in and of itself that he had managed to make it. He had made an avatar. The concept was simple. It followed the same principles that astral travel followed, only this time, only a part of his astral body was bestowed onto an entity made from Shinsu. He had read on the box that Enryu was famed for being able to make life from Shinsu. And with that idea, he had incorporated it into ritualistic magic. The first step was pinpointing himself as a creature from the spirit world. The next step included the offering of the entity to the pinpointed existence and finally, asking the existence to offer up a part of their astral body to possess the Shinsu. It was akin to the possession of Beyonders by evil gods through the mirror divination, like what had happened to one of Melissa's friends in Volume 1 of Lord of Mysteries. Only this was far easier as the entity to be possessed was being rightfully offered to the existence solely for the sake of possession. And finally, when the possession was done, a part of Winston's astral body was given to the Shinsu for as long as Winston wanted. Of course, there were a lot of downsides to this. The first and foremost being that the avatar, unlike the marionettes of the Fool and the avatars of the Error, lacked information procession and could not operate autonomously. It made Winston have to split his focus, like operating at different levels in a hierarchical arrangement, controlling the actions to two different sets of bodies. In layman terms, it was like trying to learn Chinese through one ear and listening to Mozart on the other. Incredibly disorienting. The next thing was that it halved Winston's spirituality reserves. And not only that, the half of the spirituality that was given to the avatar couldn't even be used fully. It was not Winston after all, only a small part of his astral body. And hence, it could hardly utilize any of his true Beyonder powers. Even the ones that worked were weaker in comparison to his main body, and took just a little longer to activate. The physical strength of the avatar was also far weaker. So weak that he would even lose to Endorsi and Anak, as Winston saw it. And finally, atop all of that, it was impossible to have multiple of them. Every time Winston made an avatar, his spirituality reserves would be halved, leaving him weakened, not to mention the avatars, even if he were to make multiple, would hardly be considered stronger than him, even in those numbers. And that's even considering the fact that he would too be weakened. All in all, it was not worth it for combative purposes. However, for a distraction, that takes care of that. Winston smiled as he watched the ranker zoom away in the direction the ship had supposedly followed. Except it hadn't. As Winston, with his enhanced eyesight that could peer hundreds of kilometers away, lost sight of the ranker, a strange shift happened in the air. The air hummed and rippled as a gigantic illusion was taken down. Immediately, Winston felt a weight off his shoulders as the spirituality drain to cover such a large structure was indeed ginormous. Truthfully speaking, such a large illusion was something he should only be able to do at the level of a demigod, which corresponded to the sequence 4 of any pathway. However, the synergy between Fool and Error, of which illusion creation was a great part of in the lower sequences, along with the spirituality increase of the 3 pathways and finally, the boost provided atop all that through Shinsu, such a wide-scale illusion did not seem to be a pipe dream anymore. Sure, it was still a daunting task. As the illusion cleared, Winston saw the ship emerging. It had already begun to descend from the sky and towards the ground, hovering just 200 meters from its destination. The crates and suspendium that had fallen down? They too had been secured soon after they crossed the clouds, the people within which had been released already in the nearby megacity. Winston looked down at the megacity, the residents of which gazed up at the floating behemoth in fear and trepidation. Sweat poured from most of their faces as they gazed upon the giant structure. The warriors of the city gathered around, weapons in hand as they waited for the ship to make its move. There were hardly any rankers here, even though most of the population in the middle tower was filled with families and family trees of rankers. There were always such cities on the lower floors where rankers didn't frequent. And the traffickers took advantage of the absence of strong people which could offer resistance to carry on unabated. However, that had changed at this moment. As Winston continued to gaze down, he spoke out. Take out in containers and free everyone. His crooked voice was still ongoing. But to the workers, within whose ears the voice rang like an alarm, it sounded as the voice that promised pain. The few workers that were atop the ship looked at him in terror, for in their eyes, he looked to be exactly like the red-skinned ranker. An illusion that had been targeted only at them. Winston smiled softly as he watched the workers scatter about and pull giant chains from the ship, slowly carrying down the containers used to traffic people. As for the suspendium, Winston was going to take a couple of containers for himself. Think of it as his fee for helping out. He chuckled, and then held his arms out as if to embrace the world and boomed out with his voice. People of the city. The men, women and children that had been abducted from here are being returned to you. Worry not, for the captain of this ship is now gone. And as the last of my gift to you, I provide you with these. Winston yelled as if proclaiming a holy decree. And then, he signaled the workers to also throw down the containers F suspendium. Of course, there was the matter of the major forces coming here to raid the suspendium, along with the more imminent threat of the rancor returning. Winston cared little about that. The thing needed for acting was the cause and the consequence. As long as he did not know about it, the aftermath had no relation with it. After all, Prometheus helping the humans did not turn out great for the Titan. There was also the reason that the avatar of Winston had not yet been completely suspended, at least not the astral projection. Funny thing about the way he created avatars, due to a loophole, the astral projection could persist for as much as 3 days, as he calculated, after the possession was cancelled. After which, it would return and merge again with his body. It was still following the rancor, taunting it and leading it further and further away. And with the added-in deception from the avatar that allowed him to lead opponents of lower intelligence without them suspecting anything, the rancor was in for a trip. If the rancor came back here before the city could get reinforcements, he would no doubt slaughter everyone. Then, it was simple a matter of bad luck. All in all, Winston would not bother with them longer than he should. In the first place, he was not a saint. He knew bad things happen all the time. He could not be a hero and stop everything that's bad in the world. In the end, it came down to a matter of self-interest. As the crates of suspendium were thrown down, crystals, bars and coins, pale blue in color poured out of them. The city folk were staggered seeing such a large amount of wealth. As the people rushed forward to carry the riches and meet back with their loved ones, Winston could not help but look at them in pity. The jihad forces would no doubt wipe this city off. If not, they would be in for a world of pain. It was tragic either way, causing chaos for the sake of it. Do you enjoy it, perhaps? Suddenly, a familiar voice sounded behind Winston, and without turning back, Winston knew exactly who it was. You seem plenty relaxed. What might be the reason, I wonder? Winston asked the 7-feet-tall man who floated atop a suitcase behind him. The man held a smile on his face with his tooth showing. His wrinkles were more enhanced at the cheeks while the rest of the face looked frighteningly plain. Winston could not help but want to comment on his strange features, but he held himself back. He could feel that the man was more than he let on. He was enigmatic. But his intuition told him one thing. He was not to be underestimated. I guess I'll get the chance to test out my prowess. Why would I not be? Have I done anything wrong here? The man asked, his smile widening ever so slightly. I would say giving away my position is a good enough reason, Winston replied. The man held up his hands in a gesture of, what can be done? I do apologize. Just couldn't help myself. Though that doesn't change the fact that you're here causing chaos. Chaos? Perhaps you're right. Winston chuckled slightly. The man continued on with the same smile. Do you find this to be comedic? Not that I have anything against it. Chaos has always been a crucial part of the tower's progression. Everywhere in the tower can be described to be chaotic after all. Not comedic, no. Just tragic. The life of the masses can really be messed up by the ruling classes. Even if someone were to rebel against it, the masses would suffer nonetheless. And so, it is logical to better yourself through them. Go with the flow and break out at the crucial moment to seize the power. He explained. Then shook his head, not willing to continue on with the conversation anymore. He continued, enough talk. It is pointless to continue on with the conversation. As the words landed, Winston took a combat stance midair. The cane he held at his right hand was put into the arms inventory that appeared by his side, and from that, a peculiar hook was taken out. How did the hook get to him when it was the avatar that had stolen it? The armed inventory worked on an owner basis. With the avatar, it recognized both of them as owners and would follow either one. With the avatar gone, the armed inventory returned to him. I haven't yet gotten the chance to test this out. Neither have I gotten the chance to fully test out my own capabilities yet. I suppose you will do quite nicely, he said. The man in front took off the hat from his head and held it at his chest. Then, he did a curt bow. It would be my pleasure to be of use to you. The sarcasm in the man's voice couldn't have been more obvious. But he continued. But before we start, why don't we introduce ourselves? Myself, Samuel Hellmans, he said. Winston raised an eyebrow at this and smiled, though it was all hidden beneath the mask. You may refer to me as Mysteries. His voice reverberated in the air, echoing through the city. The man's eyes scanned Winston, gleaming as he did so. Mysteries, Chapter 53. Mysteries, 4. The mechanical floating ship had already been moving away as soon as Samuel appeared behind Winston. Because Winston had stopped maintaining his illusion after the containers were transported down, The workers had realized their blunder and opted to get out of here as fast as possible. Of course, there was also a bit of deception mixed in with their panic that made them run. Winston and Samuel looked at each other, silent and still. No one moving before the other. Winston could feel that the man was strong. Not to the extent of a rancor, far below it, but he was, strangely, stronger than the two Jihad princes. It was not clear how such a thing were possible, and only made the man seem more enigmatic. It was at times like these that Winston wished his intuition and divination ability was stronger. At that time, a sudden thought came to Winston. Curiosity needs to be quenched. I'll just perform spirit mediumship after I kill him. That's right. Winston had already decided that the man would not leave here alive. Seeing the man 2 times, at such massive distances apart within the course of a month, was more than enough reason for Winston to conclude him as a target for direct elimination. The silence persisted for a bit more. The people down below who had already calmed down now looked above them with a deep sense of foreboding. The air around them had gotten heavier, appearing difficult to breathe even. The Shinsu, although there was no fighting yet, was starting to become chaotic solely because of the presence of Winston's intent to kill. Samuel on the other hand seemed to only be observing him, not appearing too keen on fighting. And then, from the clear sky, fell a singular last drop of water, right between them in the sky and down to the ground. And that was the icebreaker. Whoosh! Boom! Immediately, a sonic boom rang out in the air, deafening the ears of the unguarded people below and causing the ears of some to rupture. Winston dashed out with speed surpassing the speed of sound and swung his hook right at the man's head, aiming for a quick finish to the fight. Freeze! He added in his mind, casting both the spell and reverse flow control. And as the hook's point neared the man's temple, a vision suddenly enveloped Winston's mind. At that moment, Winston tilted his body mid-air and turned the attack to the head into a sweeping motion towards his chest. And at the same instant, something dashed out from under the man's trenchcoat. It was a small snake-like being with scales that resembled a turtle's shell. The snake's tail traveled to intercept the original trajectory of the hook, while in its mouth grew a small ball of Shinsu. However, just as quickly as it had appeared, it noticed its blunder and shifted its trajectory, shielding the man from danger. Clang! Shaya! The bong shot out towards Winston, who dodged the attack by a hair's width and used his momentum to kick outwards towards Samuel's chest. Boom! The man flew back uncontrollably, as did the snake that was with him, eventually falling down and down to the ground. The man landed atop a large building, crushing it as he did so and taking a few dozen lives in the process. As the dust settled, the man came out from under the rubble, the snake hovering around him and a shimmer of blue covering his body. A Shinsu barrier. Winston smiled as he got closer to the man. So he's like Sun Wu Ha, an anima. What is he using as the fishbowl? Is it hidden beneath the trenchcoat? Or is the trenchcoat itself the fishbowl? Winston mused. As he drew closer, Samuel smiled at him and said, "It's not too nice to steal from others." Winston gave out a small chuckle and twirled the suitcase in his left hand. "You mean this? I have to take some souvenirs, you know?" The short moment of contact with a man during the kick was enough for Winston to steal the suitcase. Actually, even direct contact wasn't needed for Winston to steal something. Only a distance of 20 centimeters had to be maintained. But it took an entire second in such a case as opposed to the instant that contact provided. And when you're so close already, you might as well touch the thing, right? The man shook his head. "Forget it, you can keep that." Then, he held his hand up, around which the snake began to twirl around. What next? As his words landed, Winston already stood in front of him. Whoosh! Boom! 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 Successive sonic booms and explosions rang out in the area as both Winston and Samuel dashed through the air, smashing through buildings and destroying the infrastructure. It was a bit weird for Winston since he had just helped the city folk so much, but here he was, personally aiding in most of their demise. Well, collateral is collateral. Can't do anything about it. Winston thought as he observed the barrier that enclosed the man. It prevented him from getting direct contact to the man, and made him particularly more tanky. A cruel glint passed Winston's eyes as he got in close to the man once again. Bongs appeared in the air, seemingly numbering in the dozens. More than half were from Winston, the other half were the combined number of the man and his pet snake. The bongs rushed along, impacting each other mid-air before they could reach the intended target. However, one bong, one of Winston's, reached the barrier despite the snake's defense. Crack! The barrier cracked, and Winston's hook reached the man. Slash! The man stepped back at the last second, suffering only a graze at his arm. However, there was one critical thing. It seems the Shinhu doesn't need a fishbowl to be controlled, Winston said as he held the trenchcoat in his arms. Due to his increased spirituality and enhancement from Shinsu, the reach extended beyond just his body, extending from any objects that connected his body to the other. He was plenty sure the trenchcoat was the fishbowl, and even if it wasn't, considering how the snake crawled out of it, it was bound to be at least inside the garment. Samuel stood with a single black shirt and black trousers. The snake still floated around him as he looked on with a smile. Memphis isn't like the uncivilized Shinhyu. He doesn't need to be controlled, he commented. Winston shook his head and threw away the trenchcoat, getting ready for another clash. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then, a terrifying force erupted from his body. Done. Samuel froze, as did the snake he held by his side. Both ensnared by a freeze spell and reverse flow control. And so, slash. Blood, the color of crimson, seemed out from the man's neck. His eyes widened and trembled in disbelief as he looked on towards the man that had just stabbed him. Never had he expected the fight to end so anticlimactically. He had underestimated his opponent based on the qualities he had shown, and so he paid the price. Bam! The man fell to the ground as the snake became active again, lashing straight at Winston. Bang! 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 Seeping air into his lungs, Winston mimicked the sound of a gun 3 times in a row, throwing compressed air bullets at the snake. Sparks flew around as the power bounced off its scales. Boom! Just then, a massive amount of Shinsu flew out of the snake's body, a desperate attempt to get Winston away. Naturally, Winston didn't dodge. His Shinsu resistance was fairly heightened at this point, and with the diffusion boundary around him, he resisted the Shinsu wave with minimal effort. After all, the power of the wave wasn't directed as an attack, but merely to buy time. He moved, slashing the hook right at the snake's head, who twisted around and around as if it itself had been turned into an amorphous form of the same divine water that fueled its powers. As the Shinsu wave disappeared, from the side, 7 more people, resembling Winston, appeared with varying weapons in their hands. They all collectively snapped their fingers, making sparks of fire erupt from their hands, which soon enveloped them whole and combined to form a blazing pyre that transformed into a flaming tornado. Boom! Why, Earl? The tornado's fiery wind swept across the buildings of the city, effortlessly destroying a circular area of 100 meters radius around Winston, charring it black and leaving all but air, for even the ashes disappeared as the raging flame of a magician's flame control ravaged through the area. However, there appeared an opposition. Slowly but surely, a bluish hue appeared at the heart of the pyre, a stream of water Shinsu that expanded around the snake and covering it in a thick layer of protection. Down below, where Samuel lay still and holding his neck to stop the crimson of life from flowing out, there too was a protective barrier made from the same blue Shinsu. The snake hissed around it, seeing many Winstons, now numbering in the dozens all around it. Piercing through illusions was its master's job. It was only the tank and the attacker. It failed to cope up with the illusion, blindly attacking all around as the flames still burned the Shinsu around it. Winston, whose actual body stood outside the flaming tornado in a veil of invisibility, smiled slightly as he watched them struggle. Better to nip the problem in the bud than to watch it grow and slowly devour its way through my life, he thought. And then, holding the hook with him, he dashed right through the flames and towards the Shinsu serpent, whose protective layer had grown considerably smaller in the fire. Holding the hook in his hand, Winston silently cast reverse flow control and freeze, simultaneously casting a lightning spell onto his weapon, making it crackle with a blue and baleful light. Clang! 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 Sparks started to fly out from the snake's body from all directions. With the many illusions distracting the snake, the invisibility that Winston's own body held and the occasional stop to its movements, the snake had no way to resist. It was thoroughly crushed without any chance of resistance. Pierce. Slash. Fresh blood poured out from its small frame as it lay limp, stabbed atop the tip of Winston's hook. He looked at it for a moment before turning his eyes to the man down below. Without the protective covering of the snake, the man would no doubt burn in the fire in seconds. For that reason, Winston toned down the flaming tornado, causing it to disappear. Slowly, he descended to the ground. "I don't like to have problems grow at my feet," he said with a chuckle. Samuel, who was miraculously still alive, spoke with difficulty as he pressed down harder at his neck. Hee cough. "I never thought it would end so fast. If I hadn't underestimated you, cough. Perhaps the outcome would have been different, mysteries. Cough. Cough. As the blood pooled beneath him, he continued. Though cough. I am curious. What made you wish to attack me so suddenly? Cough. Just a hunch. Winston shook his head, unwilling to elaborate. Cough. Hee. That's rough. Samuel managed to squeeze out one final time before the light left his eyes. Seeing him laying still on the ground, Winston checked his condition thoroughly to ensure that he truly was dead. And finally, after confirmation, he pulled out a suspendium coin. Samuel Hellmans is dead. He repeated 7 times. Ding! The coin landed atop his hand, showing a clear heads. Nodding to himself, Winston took the body and disappeared into flames, heading to a safe place to perform spirit mediumship. Winston didn't manage anything interesting from the spirit of the dwarf. He was simply a dwarf that was following a path he could see. He saw a change in the usual paths, and so he tried to stop the changes. It just so happened that the changes led him to cross paths with Winston twice. And Winston wasn't one to ignore a bad premonition. Pitiful. Winston mused as he shook his head. He looked towards the hotel where the team was staying at. After a whole 3 days of travel, he had arrived again to rest for a bit. He had burned the body after spirit channeling, just to make sure, along with the body of the little snake. The avatar had also been completely dispelled 2 days prior, so he was plenty sure that the city might have been razed to the ground at this point. But he cared little about that. He stretched his body, feeling the strength of his body having returned and hearing a satisfying pop. I suppose I'll relax for a few days. For real this time. He chuckled. Chapter 54. Undercurrents. Scribble, scribble. Scribble, scribble. A dimly lit room, illuminated only by a singular light over a desk, housed a male humanoid. In his hand lied a feather pen of which he made use of by writing away on a notebook that was opened up before him. The man wrote with patience and thought, stopping occasionally to take a good look at the contents he had completed before nodding along and writing the next passage. There was silence in the room. The only sound was of controlled breathing and the scribbling of pen on paper. An unknown amount of time passed as the man closed the notebook. As he leaned back into the comfortable chair, his face finally came into the light. It was Theolise Clear, the newly passed regular from the floor of tests, now climbing the tower in hopes of becoming a ranker. It had been some time since he passed from the 2nd floor. He was on the 4th floor now, climbing on with a team of somewhat competent people. Although they weren't too great, they took care of each other's weak points. And Theolise in particular, who was blessed with a strong physique since birth, was the strongest fighter in their group, a fisherman that led the team in battle. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, contemplating the thoughts of the strange man he had met, the one that changed his fate and allowed him to climb the tower. The way to get to the test floor was strange. It was anything but safe, even bizarre in the types of sceneries and creatures he had seen and heard while on the journey. But by far the most eerie thing he had seen in his life was Samuel. The silver dwarf was heartless, yet he was childish. His way of speech was extremely polite, to the point that you would skim over the speech that left his mouth only to realize he was talking about brutally skinning someone while they were alive and then slash out brain to feed it to a Shinhu. It was somewhat absurd, his situation. It wasn't until he was in far too deep into the path that he realized there wasn't truly a chance to turn back. If he had refused at that point, Samuel might have left him there to die or killed him outright. And so, the only chance for him was in moving forward and dealing with anything that might trouble him in the future. He had to help the strange man no matter what. Regardless, there was a small part of Theolise that wished he didn't come back. The tower was expansive. Maybe they would never run into each other again. But the chance of that was slim. For a silver dwarf who could see paths, there was no chance he would lose his way to never find him. His eyes inexplicably turned towards a small bag that was on the bed. The contents of the bag were unknown, but the sight of the bag brought a look of contemplation to his face. Theolise sighed, feeling tired. He leaned forward and closed the notebook, his journal that he was writing. Boo! Suddenly a voice sounded behind him, and a shadow loomed over his head. Ah! Theolise screamed, his chair tipping over and falling to the back. However, he quickly got up and backed off towards the wall, adopting a boxing stance. Who goes there? He yelled before observing the figure that had invaded his room. And as he laid eyes upon the man, his blood instantly chilled. The figure put its hands up, appearing harmless. Now, I don't wish to fight. After all, we are now partners. Don't you say? Theolise sighed, trying to calm his rapidly beating heart. Hello, Mr. Samuel. Please. I feel that we're beyond referring to each other with such pleasantries, right? Just call me Samuel. The 7-foot man admitted with a compassionate smile. He walked over to the bed and sat down. Theolise straightened his posture and cleared his throat before speaking. Ahem. What brings you here? He asked. Samuel's eyes were clear and focused as he replied to the inquiry. At that point, Theolise noticed a missing part of his attire. He wasn't carrying the suitcase he always had with him. As a matter of fact, all of his clothes seemed to be different, appearing new and of different, slightly lighter colors. There has been a change of plans. I am especially pleased to announce that I have located the anomaly. Theolis' eyes widened just a tiny bit. So soon? Why? Did you think it would take time? No. That's not what I meant. Theolis tried to explain. Seeing his flustered state, Samuel chuckled. To tell you the truth, the way I found the perpetrator was less than ideal. It almost resulted in my demise. However, I was able to escape. Samuel flashed a brilliant smile. Hearing his words, Theolis felt a chill travel up his spine. They were going against someone stronger than this dwarf before him. That alone made him feel an oppressive and foreboding feeling. He was clearly not up to par for it. What happened? Let's say I got stabbed and burnt. I also lost one of my companions, but that's not important. And your suitcase. Let's call it collateral damage. What of the others you chose? Samuel shook his head, his smile faltering and turning into a small frown. The results so far have been disappointing. Out of the hundreds that I approached and led to the tower, only 3 made it out of the 2nd floor. And of those 3, only you managed to get past the 3rd. Theolis' eyes widened a bit. It can't be that exaggerated, can it? Oh, but it is. The tower is such a place. The person's will, not only his body and mind, is tested all the same. Blood sweeps along each floor and millions of regulars die every month to climb the tower. As I said, the others get culled out. Only the special remain. There was silence for a few seconds as he finished. Then, Theolis said, "Which floor do I need to ascend to?" Samuel raised an eyebrow. "What's this? Feeling excited?" Theolis shook his head in denial. "No. It would just be better to have a goal to look forward to. I'd rather finish this business while the target is still climbing the tower, right?" "You're not wrong about that. However, by your speed, the target will long surpass you. The gap as of now isn't large, but it will only grow. As for now, the target is on the 13th floor and preparing to get to the 14th. I suspect they would be on the 20th floor in a little less than 2 years." Hearing his words, Theolis, somehow, felt a wave of relief wash over him. Maybe he didn't have to face the man. However, the next words that left Samuel's mouth crushed that thought. "And so, I will personally join your team and train you for that time." That's a bit much, don't you think?" "Not at all. I'd like to safeguard at least one of my investments." "Well, I don't plan on dying either way. I feel that you can rest assured," Theolis said, trying to escape the situation. Samuel laughed a bit. "No one plans on dying. Everyone always wants to survive. Aren't we all just fighting to survive another day? Waiting for another day to pass and witness the beginning of the next? That doesn't work out for the majority." Theolis couldn't find any argument to refute his words. And there began the bad days for Theolis. And as he would later write in his diary entries, the training was like snatching a fish from the mouths of a white steel eel. Whatever that meant was up for debate. Samuel sat atop a large stone monolith that stood alone at the top of a building. The 4th floor was a peculiar floor. The main district where the regulars arrived at was filled with all sorts of Gothic architecture. Stone spires rose up from the ground, long and turning hallways alongside ancient-looking Gothic buildings and manors. But that too was mixed in with high technological advancements of the tower, making up for a particularly striking scenery. Samuel looked up towards the overcast sky. The night was blanketed completely as a soft drizzle poured down to the ground. Samuel could not help flash a smile as he looked on towards the far end of the clouds, where a whirlpool of sorts seemed to be forming. "You still draw attention whenever you appear," he said suddenly, speaking to seemingly no one but the darkness. Then, a humanoid figure walked out from the darkness. In front of the monolith that stood at a large height of 20 meters, the figure seemed tiny. Puny even. The face of the figure couldn't be seen, thickly veiled by darkness. "I can't help it. Being subtle and hidden isn't the best of my talents. And when you're as infamous as I am, that administrators needs to pay extra attention. They don't want anything to do with me." Samuel laughed a bit at his reply. "That is true. So, what are you planning this time?" "Oh, nothing. Just found something interesting." "Interesting? Something that interests you? That's new." "New indeed. I haven't seen something like this for centuries." "And what of that new companion you're raising?" "That's just a pastime. New toys are always good to play around with." Playing around in a large game. They aren't needed at all. Just spices in a dish. After all, food doesn't seem appetizing if there are no spices in it. And here you call me chaotic. I merely follow destiny. Even without my meddling, those people would not survive long. And even if they do, they wouldn't achieve anything. Isn't it better to be part of something big? That's all it is to you? A big game. The man shook his head, walking further into the dark. Not exactly, no. I can change it, overwrite it, but why do that? Better to add to the pages of fate. The man chuckled. You're still just as sociopathic as ever. And yet you go on and on to talk all philosophical. Is that wrong? I think you just want to appear smarter. Damn right I do. The man laughed. Then, he turned to Samuel. I wish to see what the fuzz was all about. The thing that caused you to be active had to be good. But turns out, it's just a farce. The man shook his head and his body began to blend into the darkness. I'll see you soon. And with the final words, he disappeared. As the shadowy figure left, Samuel could not help but narrow his eyes. Not a farce, no. It is far more important than that. Again, he spoke to no one in particular. It is something that can change the tower forever. Chapter 55. Mundane Life. Winston woke up early, feeling a strange sensation at the back of his mind. He looked out of the window where the sun was rising, casting the glorious morning rays over the horizon where the sun kissed the sea and a blend of yellow and black extended from the water into a shadow of the sun stretched across hundreds of meters. After the previous shenanigans with the floating ship, his current potion had also been boosted in digestion. It was due to the magician potion, feeding off the hundreds of thousands of people that offered feedback to his performance, and added in with how he had fooled the ranker with his avatar, the potion had reached 99% digestion, standing at the precipice of complete assimilation. The strange sensation he felt was also due to this. A weight that had been on his shoulders for so long had waned, making his spirit feel a lot more relief. He got up from the bed and stretched his body. Then went to the bathroom to freshen up. The team had been thrilled when he came back from his trip. Winston had not told them of the purpose of his trip, only mentioning that he wanted to explore the area around the hotel a bit and maybe scout for new teammates. Naturally, no one was to suspect him. It wasn't even a matter of his increased charisma and natural deception prowess. It was simply a matter of the respect he commanded in the group. Anyhow, after he was back, Amon was back in full spirits again, returning to normal. And strangely enough, Anak was a lot more tame compared to when he had left. Previously, she always fought with Endorsi on the smallest things, only listening to Winston and sometimes Shibisu on things. But now, she became a lot more sociable. Curious. Winston had thought at the time and chosen to not worry about it. He needed not to worry about the internal struggles of the team too much. After all, he had his own to worry about. Besides, he was never too great at offering moral or emotional support. He was the type to deal with everything before it started. And if it reached a tipping point, he would get to work to improve the situation. He never bothered with other people. And now, when he actually had to think over such things, despite the error pathway giving him better socializing skills, he honestly did not know how to. So he decided to not worry about it. Doing something one was not adept at could cause more problems than good. He knew that much from experience. Without anything much to do this morning, he headed out of his room to the breakfast hall, meeting up with Endorsi and Shibisu on the way. So, where did you explore on the floor? Endorsi asked as they sat down on the table. In front of Winston was steel eel curry while Shibisu and Endorsi had a sandwich with coffee and rice and omelette respectively. Nothing much. Just explored around the different cities in the inner tower. There's not much to see on this floor, Winston said uninterestingly. His expressions displayed dissatisfaction with his travels and a wave of disappointment. Heh, seems boring. Tell me about it. It was far more disappointing than I could ever had imagined. Winston shook his head with a bitter smile. It was not all lies. While traveling from the inner tower to the middle tower, he had seen many strange and bizarre things. But they were all within the realm of stuff he had already seen. He had heard of the journey between the inner and the middle tower to be strange and eerie, filled with all sorts of sceneries. Even more so for the paths and places where Shinsu behaved differently. However, he had not seen anything too crazy. Shibisu took a sip out of his coffee and smiled at him. What do you say? When should we resume climbing? Winston looked at him. You tell me. Has the break been good enough for you yet? Shibisu smiled sheepishly. I've already relaxed to my heart's content. Same for the others. I don't think we should delay any longer. It could cause a dip in our points. Endorsi also expressed her agreement. That's right. Can you imagine a princess of Jihad having to take loans? The rumors would be all over the tower and I would be ruined, she exclaimed. Winston and Shibisu nodded, throwing her comment to the back of their heads, not giving it the slightest peace of mind. Then I suppose we can resume the climb in 2 days. Tell everyone to get ready. Winston said. Are you sure? You just got back from the trip. Dorsey said. What do you think I gave the 2 days for? The response came with a smile. The rest of the breakfast passed in random small talk. Give that back, you witch. What did you call me? You jerk. Anak and Dorsey fought over the television remote while Zarin and Amon watched them rumble. They do feel like sisters when you look at them. Zarin whispered to Amon. That's true. Amon could not express any more agreement. The two princesses, although on the surface seemed to hate each other's guts, were all too caring for each other. To their left sat the little girl, Sun Wu Nair, and to their right laid Lore in his ever-present sleeping blanket. Sun Wu laughed a bit, seeing the two sisters destroy the table in a quarrel. Don't say that to their face, haha. They'll never admit it. Zarin and Amon nodded at her words. At that moment, Shibisu came into the hall, wearing his signature tracksuit. However, seeing the brawl between the two princesses, his smile quickly froze, as did his feet. What the hell? He exclaimed and tried to stop the two. Stop it, you crazy ladies. Everything you break will have to be paid for when we leave. He yelled, trying to get into the fight. However, one backhand from Dorsey sent him flying out and towards the group. Shibisu landed before them and got up with a comical tear in his eye. Why am I so pitiful? He sobbed. You shouldn't be trying to get between them, Mr. Shibisu. Amon said with a chuckle. That's practically a death sentence for you know, said Zarin. If you persist, they might just open up your head with a brick. And of course, Sun Wu was not one to be left out in a conversation. Practically everyone in their group was here as of now, save for Winston. The rest of the regulars that had ascended alongside them had been separated and chose to walk their own paths. Shibisu sighed, getting up to sit alongside them. What was on the TV before? Shibisu asked, looking at the screen where a show about forbidden love between the princess of a kingdom and a normal boy that wanted to climb the tower was running. It was the interview of Yuri Jihad. Interview. Something about being the first princess in centuries to be able to get 2 of the 13-month series. Anak seemed to be really into that. Amon shook his head as he replied. At that moment, Zarin spoke up. So, what's the plan? The plan? Well, I've yet to have that discussing with anyone. A meeting needs to be called to decide. Shouldn't you two just decide between yourselves? Sun Wu chimed from the side, placing a finger at her chin and tilting her head to the side as if contemplating. The decision needs to be between the entire team. It's better that way. Zarin chuckled at the side. Any decision you two take will be followed. That's how we operate in the first place. Shibisu shook his head with firm conviction. That might be the case. But it is absolutely crucial to hear everyone out. Zarin shrugged his shoulders, not minding his way of operation. After a while, the sisters calmed down and everyone was able to sit down and watch something else on the TV. In Winston's room, a baleful blue glow was cast onto the walls as a giant ball of Shinsu hovered in front of him. It was nearly 3 times the size of Winston, almost touching the ceiling with a radius of 2.5 meters. The Shinsu sphere rippled and changed, sprouting tendrils and various forms of amalgamated extensions that merged back into it. The liquid mass of Shinsu moved as if it were alive, observing the surrounding and moving as per the observation. Before it, Winston sat onto a stool with one hand drawn towards the ball and the other scribbling away onto a notebook. The Tales from the Lake. With his potion nearly digested, Winston truly felt he only needed a small push to achieve full assimilation. And although he had thought about doing something about that in the next test he would take, he decided to change that. And so, at this point, he was trying to trigger the digestion of the cryptologist potion through engineering about Shinsu and its various forms. The form before him? Making a brain is both theoretically and practically possible with some effort and intelligence. However, it doesn't act as I had intended. The flow mimics the brain signals in a biological organism. At this point, the flow isn't just simple laminar or turbulent. It has turned into thousands and perhaps even millions of extensions of itself. The flow autonomously adopts laminar and turbulent properties to sense, compute and act as would a living organism. Interesting. Winston could not help but mutter. He had created a brain. A system of Shinsu where each particular droplet of Shinsu in the collective whole acted as a separate neuron, living, computing and sharing information with each other. Of course, it wasn't truly living. Winston was not at that level yet. After all, the Shinsu was still getting regulated by himself. It was but an imitation and an experiment to see how Shinsu was able to autonomously arrange itself into a functioning unit based on a simple command. Envisioning was the key with Shinsu. And Winston, being a scientist could envision things far better than someone that had no knowledge of the intricacies of such matters. A self-sustaining computing unit that can operate by itself. That was Winston's vision. And although he had laid the framework well, like arranging the shinsu in a mesh-like structure and starting the process of information exchange, the brain evolved. It simultaneously arranged itself into a state where efficiency was the maximum that could be at the current stage. As he wrote along the pages of the diary, his spirit vision scanning the shinsu sphere with frightening concentration. He could feel the weight on his spirit disappearing slowly. Cryotologist wasn't a scientist. Merely finding out new theories and testing them couldn't perform digestion. One needed to decrypt obscure pieces of information. And as it turns out, shinsu was perfect for that. The sheer amount of ways shinsu could morph itself and transform to achieve various function was astounding. And since no one except for a selective few had done much research about it, it was the quintessence of something he needed to decrypt. Ashel Edwardu and Pa Bida Gustang had their research, but it was widely limited to their own respective domains. Gustang established a system around shinsu, and found various ways it could be used in both combat and mundane ways. He underlined the limitlessness of shinsu as described by the tower's inhabitants. Then Edwardu only focused on how shinsu in different concentrations could affect weapons and their usage. The common knowledge was limited only to that. As Winston continued to scribble away, he lost track of time. And by the time he finished writing the last word onto the notebook, he felt something breaking down and fusing with his essence, transforming his spirit and body and truly becoming one with him. He closed his eyes, feeling the blissful stimulation that he was able to feel only upon the total digestion of a potion. Sequence 7, Pass. He smiled.